Hello everyone, welcome to our audiobook channel. If you enjoy this story or want to hear more exciting content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your feedback helps us improve and bring even more captivating stories. Yes, we invite you to listen to part 1 of the series. Enjoy listening. Chapter 1, 1001, Beaten to Death. 1 Chapter 001, Beaten to Death. Sister, sister. A voice called out by her ear, soft and sticky, but anxious. Zhuang Qingning opened her eyes and saw a young girl with a worried expression. The girl had a thin face, her cheeks slightly sunken in, and her hair some sort of yellowish brown. At first glance, it was clear that she was suffering from chronic malnutrition. The robe draped around her was clearly an old one handed down from her older sister, too big for her small frame. It made her look like a large-headed doll. Even her hair bun was slightly fluffy because it hadn't been combed for a long time. Sister, are you awake? The young girl was visibly excited to see Zhuang Qingning's eyes flutter open. She reached out a small hand to feel her sister's forehead and then touched her own. It seems like the fever has broken. But just because your fever's gone, doesn't mean you're fully recovered. You can't stay in bed, you must get up and work. Aunt has scolded us several times already. We're late today. I'm afraid she won't let us eat breakfast. I'm fine, but sister, if you're unwell and can't eat, what can we do? The young girl said through a veil of tears. Being such a loving person at her tender age, she's a well-behaved child. Zhuang Qingning stirred a little, stretching out her arm, the inside of which was aching due to the fever. She patted the young girl's head gently. Qingsui dear, your sister is fine. I'm all better. Zhuang Qingsui was the name of the girl standing before her, her biological sister in this world, only 8 years old this year. She had transmigrated. After working late into the night, on a rainy night, she was hit by a truck that ran a red light while she was returning home alone. She died on the spot. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself in an unknown ancient era, reincarnated as a 13-year-old girl who shared her name. Her parents had died early. In this era where women had no inheritance rights, the house and farmland belonging to Zhuang Qingning's family did not go to her and her sister, but per the rules, they went to her uncle's family who had offspring. In return, Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui were to be raised by their uncle's family until they were old enough to marry. However, the method of this care. The sun's already high, and you're still lazing around at home. Do you think you're little princesses who don't have to work? Get out here and work right now. What a couple of lazy ones. If you aren't pushed, you don't work. Every day I feed you and all I get are 2 lazybones. I'd do better feeding a dog than feeding you 2 little brats. A plump woman of medium height stood in the courtyard with her hands on her hips, shouting angrily. Her rage caused the fat on her face to shake. The maliciousness in her eyes seemed ready to swallow people whole. This was their aunt, Mrs. Song. Sister. Zhuang Qingsui pulled Zhuang Qingning's sleeve, her voice teary. Mrs. Song was usually harsh with them. Now, she was scolding them in the courtyard. Once they went outside, they would probably be met with a tirade of abuse and blows. It's all right. Zhuang Qingning climbed out of bed. Her clothes were full of patches upon patches, and her shoes were of the same kind. One of the shoes even had a small hole at the toe because of long usage. This Mrs. Song was extremely cruel. She had taken a house and 5 acres of land from Zhuang Qingning's family, promising in front of the clan to take care of her 2 nieces, but in reality, this was how they were treated. The girls were always hungry and cold and had to do a lot of heavy work. If Mrs. Song was unhappy, she would ruthlessly beat and scold them. One can only assume that the previous Zhuang Qingning had died due to years of hard labor and malnutrition, unable to recover from a simple cold. Zhuang Qingning frowned. Her disdain for her cruel aunt began to swell from her heart, making her hold her breath and causing her to cough a few times. Sister, you should rest a bit more. I can do the work. Zhuang Qingsui, looking worried, supported her. Worst case scenario, she would work till midnight again. Don't worry. I'm all right already. Zhuang Qingning lightly patted Zhuang Qingsui's head. Although they had just met, Zhuang Qingning could feel this younger sister's kindness and thoughtfulness. It seems that in the future, she will need to take good care of her little sister instead of the original Zhuang Qingning. The two sisters stepped out of their room. Although room was quite the generous term, it was more of a shed, originally a cattle pen. Ever since the cattle died of disease, the shed remained vacant until Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui arrived and Mrs. Song settled them in. Its walls were made of sun-dried bricks, topped with a thatched roof, and even lacked a door. The shed was virtually indistinguishable from being outdoors when the wind blew. Auntie. Zhuang Qingning walked into the courtyard. Oh, you've finally decided to get up. Mrs. Song sneered at Zhuang Qingning, all you did was get caught in the rain. It's not even cold out today. Why did you need to take to bed with a fever? Which child in the village hasn't been drenched in the rain? Are you a pampered princess? You've lazed about for 2 days instead of working. I think you're just trying to skip work, shirking about. All the delayed work will have to be made up by you too. For the next few days, each meal for you will consist of just half a steamed cornbread. Upon hearing this, Zhuang Qingsui was nearly brought to tears. The family normally ate steamed cornbread made from mixed cornmeal and flour. However, the girls were given bread made from cornmeal mixed with sweet potato flour, which hardly filled them up. With the amount of work they did daily, a single piece of bread per meal wasn't sufficient, and they would feel incredibly hungry before the next meal. If they were to share half instead, it would be genuinely starvation-inducing. Mrs. Song truly had a ruthless heart. Zhuang Qingning gritted her teeth, with no reaction on her face. She dropped her hands and lowered her gaze. I'll cook right away. Well, what are you waiting for? Mrs. Song quirked an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth full of mockery. The two certainly needed scolding, or they wouldn't know what to do. In the future, they should be hardened for another few years. When they come of age, they should be married off to whoever offers the most dowry, whether he's blind, disabled, or a widower. Understood. Zhuang Qingning responded and started kneading the dough for the steamed cornbread. I'll go rest for a bit. Call me once the food is ready and remember to stay quiet. If you disturb my sleep, watch your hides. Also, if you dare to sneak a bite, I'll break your legs. Mrs. Song continued her tirade. I'll remember. Zhuang Qingning didn't stop her work. Mrs. Song gave a cold huff and waddled into the house with her plump body. Sister, I'll start the fire for you. Zhuang Qingsui, who had just finished sweeping the courtyard, entered the kitchen to lend a hand. The water in the pot was boiling, and the steamer was put on the stove. The freshly steamed cornbread in the steamer gradually exuded a tantalizing aroma. Zhuang Qingsui, who was already starving, became even hungrier upon smelling the aroma. Her mouth was filled with saliva, which she swallowed repeatedly. Here. Zhuang Qingning took a piece of bread weighing 2 Chinese ounces from the steamer to give to Zhuang Qingsui. Eat up. Sister. Zhuang Qingsui widened her eyes in alarm. If Auntie finds out, she'll kill us. Chapter 2, 2002, Establishing a Female Household. 2 Chapter 002, Establishing a Female Household. We always behave ourselves, doesn't that make our lives miserable enough? No matter how submissive we are, Auntie's heart is just too cruel to allow us any happiness. Just do as I say for now, eat as much steamed cornbread as you can, we have things to do afterwards. Zhuang Qingning spoke. Her firm tone slightly calmed the flustered Zhuang Qingsui. Already extremely hungry, she took the cornbread from Zhuang Qingning's hand and began gulping it down. After eating 3 cornbreads, Zhuang Qingsui let out a big satisfied burp. Sister, I'm full now. I'm almost there too. Zhuang Qingning took out a clean cloche, packed the remaining cornbread securely inside it, and pushed it carefully in her blouse. Zhuang Qingning, being lean and wearing loose clothing, managed to hide the bundled cornbreads well under her waistband, making it undetectable. After they had finished packing, Zhuang Qingning took Zhuang Qingsui's hand. Let's go. Although she didn't know where they were going, she would follow wherever her sister went. Zhuang Qingsui didn't ask any questions, but just quickened her pace to match Zhuang Qingning's. The two of them ran to the eastern part of the village, to the house of the village chief, Zhuang Jingye. Zhuang Jingye was washing himself in the courtyard. When he saw Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui, he spat out the salty water from his mouth, wiped his lips with a handkerchief, and asked, "Aren't you two the daughters of the Rahai family, Ning and Sui? What brings you here so early?" Respected uncle, Zhuang Qingning bowed politely. My sister and I have come to you today to ask for an independent family unit for women. An independent family unit for women. Zhuang Qingsui was taken aback. She had thought that Zhuang Qingning had come to lodge a complaint against Mrs. Song and wanted the village chief to protect them from being mistreated. To her surprise, their goal was something far more astonishing. Zhuang Jingye was also startled, his hand holding the willow branch, froze in surprise. His assessing gaze swept over Zhuang Qingning's tall, straight figure as he asked, "Why do you want to establish a matrilineal household? Our parents have passed away, leaving no male heir in our family. I'm the eldest daughter, and by rights, I can establish a matrilineal household with my sister. But in our village, there has never been a precedent for establishing matrilineal households. Even if your parents had left an inheritance, you separated afterwards, therefore, you'll still get nothing from it, and you'll face a dire poverty in the future. Furthermore, matrilineal households, because they have no male members, are exempt from compulsory labor, but they are required to pay a 30% higher tax than regular households. If you establish a new household, you will have no house, no land, and no livelihood. If you can't pay the taxes, you'll be taken to work as forced labor. Be aware, this is no child's play." Zhuang Jingye cautioned with a furrowed brow. "Thank you for your consideration, uncle. I have given this issue careful thought, so you don't have to worry about me," Zhuang Qingning replied confidently. Women not getting any part of the family property was a rule of this era, an unchangeable fact, so there was no rush. Everything that was owed to her, and every debt that needed to be collected, would be accounted for in due time. Seeing this, Zhuang Jingye lowered his head in contemplation, put down his toothbrush, and uttered in a hushed tone, "Even though you have made up your mind, I would still advise to rethink this. Establishing a matrilineal household is serious business, we should discuss this at length. You should go home first, allow me to discuss this with your uncle Zhuang Rumen, then we'll decide. How does that sound?" If everybody started making unauthorized decisions like Zhuang Qingning, demanding to establish their matrilineal households, wouldn't that be chaos in the village? "Uncle," Zhuang Qingning's voice turned colder, her pitch increased slightly. "According to current laws, in the absence of men in a household, widows, and eldest daughters, are all eligible to establish matrilineal households, without needing approval from others. I am fully qualified to do so, so why am I not allowed? Why I insist on establishing a separate household with my sister, I assume you, the village chief, understand. It's because life truly has become unbearable for us this way, and that's why we must walk this path. If you refuse our decision to establish a separate household and decide to consult with my eldest uncle about this matter, then that would amount to pushing us back into the fire pit we just crawled out of. If it is indeed true that we have no way to live here with dignity, then there is simply no reason for us to continue living. We'll just find a hemp rope and go to the county town to hang ourselves in front of the county government office. Let everyone see how we're driven to death by our ruthless eldest uncle and aunt, and by the inaction of our village chief. Or perhaps, if you, village chief, aren't afraid of such a scene, and are still intent on sending us back home, that's perfectly fine. Let me make myself clear now, it will be a white knife going in and a red knife coming out, or a packet of rat poison in the well, everyone will lose, and it's all up to you, village chief. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, there is truly no difference." Zhuang Qingning's bold words were filled with determination, making Zhuang Jingye, the village chief, break out in cold sweat. Zhuang Jingye had often met with Zhuang Qingning before, who always appeared submissive, accepting whatever happened quietly, hardly speaking loudly. But today, she fiercely spat out these harsh words. But then again, even a rabbit, when cornered, will bite, let alone desperate humans. Mrs. Song's behavior is well known to everyone, in that she treats her twin nieces with such harshness that it's unbearable to see. It seems that the girls are at the point where they can no longer bear it, and are determined to fight to the death. If Zhuang Qingning is making such deadly threats at this moment, should she really be driven to the edge, ready to stab with a knife or administer rat poison? As the village chief himself, even if he were lucky enough to survive, his prospects would be over, and he might even be vilified by others. But then again, verbal threats can be made by anyone. At this moment, Zhuang Qingning is only a 12 or 13-year-old child. Is she truly capable of rebelling to such an extent? Zhuang Jingye's eyes flickered, pushing his earlier shock aside, and barked, "You're still a child, what kind of talk is this? Does the village chief mean he does not believe that I am capable of such action?" Zhuang Qingning snorted coldly, her eyes filled with menace. All right, then you just wait here and brace yourself. That said, she dragged Zhuang Qingsui out, heading not towards Zhuang Rumen's house, but in the direction of the village well. Seeing this, Zhuang Jingye suddenly panicked. There have been cases of people resorting to desperate measures when forced into a corner, and he would never dare to gamble with the lives of one family, even the whole village for this matter. Wait. Zhuang Jingye hastily stopped the two of them. After considering for a moment and mopping the cold sweat from his forehead, he cleared his throat. All right, since you insist so stubbornly, I agree for you to establish a separate household. Thank you, village chief. Upon hearing Zhuang Jingye's agreement, Zhuang Qingning also visibly relaxed. The bold are afraid of the stubborn, and the stubborn are afraid of those who are fearless of death. That's always how it goes in this world. The more defiant you are, the more others fear you. If you always accept things passively, others will not sympathize with you, they may even criticize you for your lack of fighting spirit. For their survival under these circumstances, the sisters will ultimately have to put on a layer of prickly armor a hedgehog would wear. Zhuang Jingye went into the house to fetch paper and ink. He wrote down the document needed for Zhuang Qingning to establish her separate household. Eventually, he stamped it with the official seal, used specifically for managing documents. He handed the document to Zhuang Qingning. You first keep this document. I will get the official seal from the county government office. Once that is done, the process will be complete. Normally, the official stamp from the county government office is needed for this to be formalized, and only then can Zhuang Qingning officially set up her separate household. However, as this process is reasonable, the stamp is just a matter of time. Right now, Zhuang Jingye did not want to waste any more time dealing with this woman who always threatened to resort to violence. His priority was to settle the matter first and think about everything else afterwards. After this, you will be a separate household with your sister. Zhuang Jingye said, with regard to life and death, it no longer has anything to do with others, you must look after yourselves. Although Mrs. Song can be cruel at times, she would never starve you to death. But you girls insisted on setting up your own household. Once you step out, you won't have a place to live or know where the next meal will come from. I really don't know what you're thinking. Do you really think that making a living is that simple and that life is that easy to get by? Chapter 3, 3003, Wealth System Number 0715. 3 Chapter 003, Wealth System Number 0715. Being unsatisfied in good times will do you no good. When you really get hungry, your pleas will fall on deaf ears. Zhuang Qingning knew that Zhuang Jingye had officially agreed, but he was not entirely supportive of her establishing a household as a woman. However, now that the household had been established, the opinions of others were no longer her concern, and she didn't want to guess about them. Zhuang Qingning accepted the document and said, "Thank you, Uncle Village Chief. I have another request, I hope Uncle Village Chief can help. Let's hear it first. If it's about sympathizing with you, giving you some food, lending you a house or something, don't even think about it. Now that my sister and I have established our household, we have nowhere to live. I know that Butcher Hua's house in the village has been vacant. We would like to move in temporarily, and we will move out once my sister and I build a new house. Butcher Hua, an outsider, came here with his one-eyed wife 5 years ago. He donated 500 coins to the ancestral hall and settled in our village, doing the business of killing pigs and sheep. However, a year ago, Butcher Hua's wife accidentally fell into the river while washing clothes. When Butcher Hua arrived upon hearing the news, his wife had already been swept away by the rushing river. Butcher Hua jumped into the river to search for her but, worn out, drowned as well. Butcher Hua had no children and no relatives. His house and courtyard had been empty and unused ever since. Although Butcher Hua's house is vacant, he is still considered as a member of our village. Before the house is claimed by anyone, it is managed by the village. You can use it if you want to now, but you have to pay an annual rent to the village. When the relatives of Butcher Hua's family come to claim the house in the future, we will give them this money as compensation. Expecting to use it for free is out of the question. Otherwise, it would be unfair to Butcher Hua's family. The house is private property after all. By the same reasoning, it would be unfair to the villagers. Why should you be able to use it for free when others can't? That is acceptable. Zhuang Qingning felt that the request was reasonable. How much is the annual rent? Butcher Hua's house has 2 tile-roofed rooms, a kitchen, and a rather large yard. The house is not dilapidated. Although our village's houses are not as expensive as those in the town, we are not far from the town either. Considering your and your sister's miserable conditions, I'll set the annual rent at 150 coins, asserted Zhuang Jingye. Okay, Zhuang Qingning agreed. However, my sister and I just established our household and we have no money and no source of livelihood at the moment, so we can't pay now. Once I earn some money in some time, I will pay the rent to you, Uncle Village Chief. I will give you 3 months. If you can pay the annual rent in that time, you can continue living in this house. If not, don't blame me for being ruthless and kicking you out. Zhuang Jingye felt that his decision was fair and generous and would not give others a reason to talk. Uncle Village Chief, rest assured, if I can't come up with the money by then, I will let you do as you please, Zhuang Qingning responded decisively. All right. Zhuang Jingye rummaged around and found the key to Butcher Hua's house and handed it to Zhuang Qingning. You can move in for now. However, let's make it clear beforehand, I am only renting this house to you because I pity you and your sister for being parentless. I have already done my utmost. If anything happens in the future, I, as the village chief, may not be able to help you. Especially if you want to borrow money because you're lacking food and clothing, that is absolutely out of the question. You've chosen to establish a household as women, you must bear the consequences yourself. You can't expect sympathy by playing the pity card. I understand Uncle Village Chief's words. Since we've chosen this path ourselves, we have to stick to it no matter what. You don't have to worry about it, Zhuang Qingning replied in a clear voice. Since our household has been established and we sisters have a place to stay temporarily, we will leave you alone, Uncle Village Chief. Zhuang Qingning led Zhuang Qingsui out of Zhuang Jingye's house, heading towards Butcher Hua's house. Zhuang Jingye watched the two of them walk away with cold eyes, giving a cold hum. I never knew Ning had such a strong character. I really underestimated her, said Mrs. Yi, Zhuang Jingye's wife, who had been watching stealthily from the kitchen. Underestimated? I think she's presumptuous. Establishing a household as women, she's just asking for death. You'll see, when they starve, they'll come to me for help. Others might criticize me, the supposedly able village chief, for allowing people to starve in the village I manage. I don't know how that's going to sting. With a cold hum, Zhuang Jingye went back inside. He's just a minor village chief and thinks too highly of himself. People may think he's the Grand County Magistrate. Where does he get his arrogance from? Mrs. Yi smirked, then continued cooking in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui arrived at Butcher Hua's house. As he was a newcomer to the village and made a living by killing pigs and sheep, Butcher Hua's house was built on the edge of the village. The walls of his courtyard were higher, even more, higher than Zhuang Qingning's. But this was better in a way, as they could live their lives in peace without being gawked at by passers-by. Upon entering, they saw the long-abandoned courtyard overgrown with weeds. The straw-roofed kitchen and house were filled with thick dust. Due to the rain and the door having been shut for many years, the wall on the north side had even started to mold. Luckily, most of the household items were still there, and they could live a basic life. Zhuang Qingning took a deep breath, then let out a long sigh. The next thing to do was to clean up, settle down with her sister, and then find a way to earn a living. As a modern person, relying on her knowledge, as long as she wasn't lazy, it wouldn't be difficult to make a living in this era. At worst, she could do some manual labor to fill her stomach first and then gradually think about getting rich. Zhuang Qingning began to plan for the future. Ding! Congratulations to the host for obtaining the Get Rich System 1.0. I am system number 0715, your personal assistant. The information that suddenly appeared in her mind made Zhuang Qingning momentarily stunned. Get Rich System, what is that? What use is it? The Get Rich System exists to help the host achieve wealth. The system has a mall module, a task module, and an achievement value module. During normal times, the host can get diligent points through labor. The diligent points can be used to exchange anything in the mall, including recipes, secret recipes, and others. The host can even customize the goods needed from the system. The system will periodically issue some daily tasks. These tasks are not compulsory, the host can choose not to do them. However, if completed, task rewards can be obtained, the content of the reward will depend on the task. When the host achieves a certain wealth value or diligent value, an achievement reward can be obtained for talent points. Talent points can enhance the host's personal attributes, such as agility, wisdom, beauty, etc. Chapter 4, 4004, picked up the sesame but lost the watermelon. For Chapter 004, picked up the sesame but lost the watermelon. The system can accommodate the host's daily needs by providing corresponding goods, arranging reasonable daily tasks, and even strategizing for the host. This system doesn't seem too bad, right? With its help, getting rich seems a lot more achievable. The system is thoughtful and strategic, making it a must-have for reborn individuals wishing to get rich and reach the peak of their lives. Proud face. This is the first time she has seen a system that boasts so much about itself. This is simply because you're reborn for the first time. The more times you're reborn, the more systems you'll experience. In any case, I, number 0715, am definitely the best among the systems. You're extremely lucky to have met me. Serious face. Whatever you say. Arguing about who's better doesn't earn money. Earlier you mentioned exchanging diligence points for items. Can I start earning these points now? Yes, you can start earning diligence points through labor now. Labor is any kind of work, such as cleaning the courtyard, cooking, farming, etc. However, the specific amount of diligence points depends on the nature, effect, and intensity of your work. Everything is based on what the system displays. So, the system is telling me to refer to the actual results rather than the illusions. Zhuang Qingning's first reaction was if the system could lie or worm out of giving her diligence points. Either way, she needed to clean the courtyard now. She could see how many diligence points she could earn and what items she could exchange them for to evaluate the value for money of this system. In any case, overthinking won't help. It's better to act first. Qingsui, let's tidy up first. From now on, your sister will look after you separately. We don't have to live under the same roof with our aunt anymore, and we will not be scolded by her. It will be a bit easier for us. Zhuang Qingning gently stroked Zhuang Qingsui's head and said, we have just moved out, and life might be a bit tough at first. But don't worry, your sister will ensure that you have a comfortable life, with good food and clothes. It's okay, sister. I'm not afraid of hardships. Zhuang Qingsui raised her little face, resolute with determination. As long as I'm with you, I'm not afraid of anything. The 8-year-old's voice was still very childish, but when she spoke, she was unyielding, which touched Zhuang Qingning, making her laugh. With Qingsui here, your sister is not afraid of anything either. Let's clean up here for the time being, settle down, and then look for ways to make money. Okay. Zhuang Qingsui nodded vigorously. As the day grew hotter, Zhuang Qingning, fearing that there might be something hidden in the weeds in the courtyard, decided to weed with her sister first. The weeded grass could just be tied into a broom for cleaning the house and walls. While the sisters were busy tidying up their new home, Mrs. Song, who had gone back to bed for a nap, woke up. Mrs. Song was awakened by her second daughter, Zhuang Qinghe, who was the same age as Zhuang Qingning, but 2 months older. Mother, why hasn't the food been cooked yet? I'm starving. While Zhuang Qinghe was carefully combing her hair, she muttered discontentedly, didn't you say I should wash my face with warm water every morning? Why didn't you even send me any water today? This cold water is bad for the skin. If you keep washing with it, it will roughen your skin. Washing with cold water will make you unsightly. Don't worry, I'll go and see what's going on. After comforting her daughter, Mrs. Song went out, cursing in a low voice, those 2 lazy bones, they didn't even bother to boil the hot water this morning. It's so late, and the food isn't ready yet. They only know how to slack off all day long. They're always dawdling when they're supposed to be doing their jobs. Am I feeding them for nothing? Enraged, Mrs. Song picked up a piece of firewood next to the stove and headed into the kitchen, muttering, these damn lazy bones probably need a good beating. Mrs. Song's words came to an abrupt halt, and she stood still, stunned. The kitchen was empty, with not a soul in sight. The only thing that was still warm was the steamer, but it was empty. The fire in the stove had not completely died down. The unburned firewood made a crackling sound. Something's wrong, Mrs. Song let out a shrill scream after a moment, those 2 ungrateful girls have run away. Although Mrs. Song was fat, her voice was high-pitched and shrill, especially irritating when she was shouting loudly. It made people feel as if their ears were ringing. Zhuang Qinghe, who was in the house, couldn't help but cover her ears. Zhuang Rumen, wearing her coat, came out of the house with a frown. "Why are you shouting so loudly? Are you afraid others won't hear you scolding people?" "Master, master." Seeing Zhuang Rumen, Mrs. Song clung to his sleeve. Her voice was much softer. Those two girls ran away. Ran away. Zhuang Rumen was also taken aback. He looked into the kitchen, which was indeed empty. The courtyard gate was wide open. Clearly, they had run away, and they had run out the front gate. "When did you notice they were missing?" Zhuang Rumen's face grew darker and his brow furrowed tighter. "I don't know." Mrs. Song shook her head. "I told them to cook and clean the courtyard this morning. I was feeling a bit sleepy, so I went back to bed. When I woke up, they were gone. Those two little bitches dared to run away. They should have been beaten more harshly. If I had known, I would have broken their legs so they wouldn't be able to run. And you're just realizing this now?" Zhuang Rumen barked. "Haven't I told you to treat them less harshly? At least on the surface, you have to look like a human. But no, you have to beat and scold them every day, as if you're adjuring everyone that you're abusing my nieces, pushing them to the brink of death. Even a cornered rabbit will bite. If you're that ruthless, of course they are going to run. I was just trying to discipline them, so they would behave and work hard. That would save us some grain." Mrs. Song knew she was wrong and whispered an excuse. "You picked up a sesame seed but lost a watermelon." Zhuang Rumen was still angry. "Now you've driven them away. I wonder who's going to work for you and take care of you now. I was hoping to marry off the eldest one in a few years so we could get some money for Qinghe's dowry. But now, there's nothing. What were you thinking?" On hearing this, Mrs. Song felt even more guilty. Right, they had over a dozen acres of farmland at home, and they had been relying on the two girls to do most of the work. The two of them did a lot of work but ate very little, like real oxen. Now that they had run away, who was going to do the farm work? And who was going to look after her? Chapter 5, 5005 Stupid Woman. 5 Chapter 005 Stupid Woman. All of the money for Zhuang Qinghe's dowry had gone down the drain. "I really didn't expect her to run away," Mrs. Song continued, her eyes welling up with tears. Already chubby with a face full of fat, crying her eyes out only made her look hideous. This made Zhuang Rumen grow increasingly unhappy. "You're too old to cry like this. If crying could bring her back, cry your heart out. At this point, we need to think quickly about what to do. Head of the house, what should we do?" Mrs. Song dried her tears with her sleeve and asked. "What else can we do? We have to find them." Zhuang Rumen replied, "Those two girls don't have any identification on them. They surely haven't gone far from the village. Someone must have seen them leaving, so we should be able to find them by following the village roads." Yes, exactly what the head of the house said. Mrs. Song nodded rapidly. "I'm leaving to look for them right away. Once I find those two mischievous girls, see how I will deal with them." They'd made her suffer a scolding from Zhuang Rumen, almost leading her to disown them. Those girls are truly wicked. They need to be turned into a bloody pulp before they understand what they should and shouldn't do. Ideally, they'd beat the daringness out of them for good. Zhuang Rumen looked at Mrs. Song's disarray and his face darkened. "How did I end up with such a stupid wife? If you keep acting like this, would anyone who saw her tell you? They'd probably rather help her hide from you. When you find them, control your anger, treat them nicely, and talk to them. Put the right people in the right jobs, and if you want to save food then serve them less, but stop constantly screaming and beating. Don't provide an opportunity for others to criticize you for being disrespectful to your nieces." "I will remember." Mrs. Song nodded again. However, Zhuang Rumen could tell from her fiery eyes that even if she agreed now, she'd probably revert to shouting and beating the moment she gets hold of Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui. He didn't know how he, being so smart, ended up with such a foolish wife like Mrs. Song. Zhuang Rumen felt both helpless and impatient. "If you know what to do, then why are you still standing there? Go find them." "All right, I'm off," Mrs. Song replied, turning her hefty body around, and hurried off. Zhuang Rumen got dressed properly and followed her out. "Qinghe, cook some breakfast. Before leaving, he didn't forget to instruct Zhuang Qinghe. Oh, Zhuang Qinghe sulked, looking disgruntled. Normally, this was Zhuang Qingning's job, but now it had fallen to her. It was frustrating. They were both such pests. Our family was nice enough to not mind your bad luck and keep you, but you were so ungrateful and ran away. You will starve to death out there. Also, my father was right about that issue. My mother was indeed too harsh normally. She frequently beat them until their faces were bruised. Anyone that wasn't blind could see it. According to me, if these two didn't listen, they deserved to be pricked with a needle on their fingers. Prick them until their bones go soft, then would they dare to run again. Sister, hurry up and cook. I'm starving. The 8-year-old Zhuang Yuanzhong rubbed his stomach. If you're so hungry, why don't you cook? Why do I have to do it? Zhuang Qinghe, who was already in a bad mood, got even angrier when rushed. Didn't father say you should do it? Zhuang Yuanzhong nudged Zhuang Qinghe's arm. Sister, I believe that it would be much better for you if they didn't come back. What do you mean? Zhuang Qinghe was a bit surprised. Think about it, if they left, wouldn't you be the prettiest one at home? Shouldn't you be happy about that? Zhuang Yuanzhong squinted his already small eyes, smiling as he spoke. It seems like that's the case. Upon hearing this, a smile crept onto Zhuang Qinghe's face. Zhuang Qingning, that damn girl, no matter how much she tanned or worked, always looked fairer and younger than her. When they stood together, she was also a bit taller. People always said Zhuang Qingning is more beautiful. This made Zhuang Qinghe very unhappy. Good that she'd left. Now she'd be the prettiest in the house. In the future, Brother Qingwen's gaze could focus more on her. Zhuang Qinghe immediately felt delighted. I'll start cooking right away. Yuanzhong, tell me what you'd like to eat. I haven't had scrambled eggs for a long time. Sister, can you make me some scrambled eggs? There are plenty of eggs at home, and since it's just the two of us, even if we have 3 or 4, nobody will know. A glint appeared in Zhuang Yuanzhong's eyes. Deal, I'll make scrambled eggs. Having fixed the last strand of her hair, Zhuang Qinghe rushed to cook, a joyous look on her face. Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui had been working non-stop since they entered the courtyard. After trimming the grass in the yard and using it to make brooms, they cleaned up the thick dust accumulated in the house. The items in the house were sorted, washed, and tidied up accordingly. The two worked till midday, washing down the cornbread they'd stolen from their aunt's house with some water. After a brief rest, they continued straight till sundown, finally bringing the house and the yard to an acceptable state. There were 2 rooms, a hall and a bedroom in the east. The hall was fully furnished with tables and benches. The bedroom contained a bed and cupboards, all thoroughly cleaned. All the personal items of Butcher Hua and his wife were buried with them when Zhuang Jingye led the funeral. The remaining valuables were sold to pay for the funeral expenses. All that remained in the house were empty bed frames and several empty boxes. Given that it is spring, they would take some wheat straws from the stack in the yard and spread them on the bed to make it softer and warmer. They were still wearing their worn-out winter clothes which would serve as covers at night. Although the kitchen doesn't have any pans or dishes, the stove is still intact. The tank might be cracked up top, but most of it could still hold water. After cleaning up and fetching water, it could serve for 3 or 4 days. The chopping board and rolling pin were in poor shape, but still usable. Chapter 6, 6006, New Home. 6 Chapter 006, New Home. In any case, after tidying up, it looked clean and neat, giving it somewhat of a homey feel. Not bad. Zhuang Qingning said, rubbing her sore waist. Zhuang Qingsui smiled and nodded. From now on, we can consider this our new home. This hardly counts as a new home. When I build you a house with blue bricks and a tile roof, with a courtyard of 2 sections, that will be a real new home. Zhuang Qingning mused Qingsui's fluffy little head. Are you hungry? A little. They had been busy all day, and Qingsui was so tired that her stomach started to growl, making her involuntarily rub her belly. The weather isn't fully warm yet, and we don't have a pot to boil water in, so we can only drink raw water. If we keep eating cold food, our stomachs won't feel good. Let's make a fire and roast some steamed cornbread for dinner. All right. Qingsui hurriedly looked for a flint in the kitchen and started a fire in the stove. Once the fire was roaring, she took a tree branch, skewered the steamed cornbread on it, and carefully roasted it by the fire. The originally doughy cornbread soon developed a crust on the outside. She took it off the fire and took a bite. It cracked satisfyingly in her mouth, filling it with a delicious aroma. Chingsue, who had eaten her fill today, was now enjoying the delightfully crunchy and aromatic roasted cornbread. She felt her life was incredibly happy and she couldn't help but grin. Seeing this, Zhuang Qingning also broke into a smile. After the two of them had eaten and drunk their fill, they tidied up their bedding and prepared to go to sleep early. "You go and tidy up the bed first. I'm going to wash my feet and join you," Zhuang Qingning said with a smile. "Okay." Chingsue bounded off, carrying a bundle of straw for the bed. Zhuang Qingning let out a sigh of relief when she saw Chingsue disappear into the house. "System, what was your number again? Show yourself." "Number 0715. That's too long. Can I call you Xiaowu from now on?" "I don't think that's a good idea, I do have a name." "If that doesn't work, then I'll have to keep calling you the system. What was your number again?" "Fine. The system doesn't quibble with humans. Xiaowu it is." "What can I do for you, host?" "Check how many points I've earned from my diligent hard work today and what items I can exchange for." "Host, you have earned 8 hardwork points today. After deducting the required 1 point to keep the system running normally, you have 7 points left. You can exchange these points for the following items." As Xiaowu finished speaking, a touch-screen display, similar to those in the modern society, appeared in Zhuang Qingning's mind. Various items were displayed on the screen in the form of pictures. Next to it were the exchange rules. Hardwork points can only be exchanged for items, not for money. To maintain the balance of this parallel universe, advanced items such as glass, rubber products, and even some recipes which can't be exchanged for trading in this world, otherwise the item will self-destruct, deduct 10,000 hardwork points, and add 20 compulsory tasks. It was obviously a system that had been through the crucible of social scorn, blocking any room for exploiting loopholes. Zhuang Qingning pulled a face and looked away from the transparent glass cup. After some consideration, Zhuang Qingning finally chose several items that were cost-effective. A pound of cornmeal, a pound of white flour, 2 eggs, 2 coarse porcelain bowls, a bit of salt, and a bit of peanut oil. They were all necessities for daily life. As it was the first time using the system, Xiaowu gave her a newbie gift pack, which included an iron pot and a spatula for cooking. Looking at these items, Zhuang Qingning frowned. Isn't the daily amount of these hardwork points a little too small? She had been kept busy all day long just to get these few items. If she could only exchange for so few items every day, wouldn't it take forever to accumulate wealth? As already mentioned before, the amount of hardwork points is determined by the importance and equivalent value of the work you do in this world, as well as its impact on the world. For example, in comparison to just hoeing a field, carpentry work can yield more hardwork points. So based on your situation, I suggest that you use your modern abilities and skills to focus on process-related or mental labor tasks. This would be an easier and faster way to earn hardwork points and exchange them for relevant items. When it comes to mental labor, as an academic underachiever in her previous life, Zhuang Qingning didn't think the modern knowledge she had would be of much use. But the processing jobs. The wheels in Zhuang Qingning's mind started to turn. "Sister, the bed is ready," Chingsue's clear voice called out from inside the house. "Coming." Zhuang Qingning put away the system, shook off the water droplets on her feet, put on her shoes, and went into the house. The straw that had been crushed by a stone grinder earlier was soft instead of crispy. As it had been sunned in the courtyard all day, it didn't have the moldy smell from exposure to the elements. On the contrary, it was imbued with the warm fragrance of the sun and felt quite comfortable to lie on. Covered with this quilted jacket, they didn't feel cold at all. The two sisters cuddled together, closed their eyes, and quickly drifted off into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, the farmers who had been working hard all day had also gone to bed early, turned off their oil lamps, and prepared to sleep. At Zhuang Rumen's house, however, the lights were still on. The flickering candlelight cast deep shadows on Zhuang Rumen's face, making his already dark complexion even more gloomy. He had spent an entire day searching the village, but failed to find any trace of the two girls. Several families, especially those close to his home, claimed they hadn't seen where the two girls had gone. "My lord, I think others are lying. Those two girls can't have just disappeared into thin air. They're not a couple of flies. I reckon someone's hiding them. If I have my way, we'll go house to house tomorrow asking questions and searching. We better look inside the houses too, and I'm sure we will find them. Mrs. Song said angrily. Stupid woman. Zhuang Rumen cursed in his heart several times, giving Mrs. Song a sidelong glance. Have you ever asked yourself why the villagers are siding with those two girls? I told you to be nice when asking for their whereabouts this morning, but you proceeded to act as if you wanted to eat them alive. Who would tell you the truth then? With the way you are acting, we may never find those two girls. After another round of quarreling, Mrs. Song lowered her head and stopped talking. She kept tugging at her sleeve, turning it almost white, but she couldn't stop herself. After a long silence, she still couldn't let go, so that's it. We're just giving up on this. Chapter 7, 7007 and 1. 7 Chapter 007 and 1. How can we let it go? Tomorrow morning, bring me a dozen eggs. I'll go to the village chief. Zhuang Rumen said, the village chief is reasonable and values family harmony the most. I'll talk to him about this. When the village chief speaks, the others naturally won't dare to side with those two brats anymore. Yes, you, the head of the family, have great ideas. Seeing that Zhuang Rumen had a plan, Mrs. Song broke into a wide smile. Once this is over and those two brats come back, follow my orders. We need to maintain face and mustn't let others catch any fault. No matter how angry or upset you are, beat them inside the house. Don't let them cry and make a fuss in the courtyard, making a scene. Zhuang Rumen spoke and Mrs. Song naturally nodded in agreement. Yes, I really remember this time, you will see. Really remember. With Mrs. Song's stupid, pig-like appearance. Zhuang Rumen was still a little skeptical, but seeing Mrs. Song pounding her chest in a guarantee, he couldn't dismiss her completely, so he waved impatiently. Fine, go to sleep. We can't waste candlelight. After speaking, he turned around and walked towards the inner room. Mrs. Song hurriedly blew out the candle and followed. The next day, the rooster crowed thrice. Done for, if you don't wake up now to work, you'll be scolded by your aunt. Zhuang Qingsui suddenly sat upright in bed. However, looking at the situation in front of her, then at Zhuang Qingning who was still asleep, she suddenly realized that she had moved out with her sister. And, her sister had said yesterday, they have to wake up naturally. Zhuang Qingsui calmly lay back down, turned over, closed her eyes and fell asleep again. When she opened her eyes again, Zhuang Qingsui was partially woken up due to hunger and partially by the aroma. The faint aroma, with a hint of sweetness, was incredibly pleasant. Seeing that Zhuang Qingning was not by her side, Zhuang Qingsui quickly got out of bed and upon reaching the door, she saw Zhuang Qingning busy in the kitchen. Sister, what are you making? It smells amazing. Zhuang Qingsui leaned towards the stove and looked into the boiling pot releasing steam. The white creamy porridge boiled in the pot, with a layer of golden egg drop floating on top. On the edge of the iron pot, there were several cornmeal pancakes sticking to the edge, exuding the fragrant aroma of cornmeal. Clearly, they were thoroughly cooked at this moment. You're awake. Zhuang Qingning promptly used chopsticks to take the pancakes off the edge of the pot and poured the egg drop porridge into the bowls for both of them. Zhuang Qingning's portioning was perfect, not too little, not too much, just 2 bowls. Rush to wash your hands and face. By the time you are done, the egg drop porridge will cool down a little and be just right to eat. Zhuang Qingning urged. Zhuang Qingsui nodded somewhat blankly, but did not move, looking confused. Sis, where did we get this flour and these eggs, this iron pot? Shoo, keep quiet. Zhuang Qingning signaled her to speak more softly. These things, they were left by our parents. They were hidden in a secret place by our mother and father, in case we ever needed them. Our parents did not give us a little brother, fearing that we would not get anything after 100 years and would not be able to survive. So, they specially put some things and money in a big jar and buried it secretly. When our parents passed away, you were still young. I was afraid you would let it slip and our uncle and aunt would find out, so I didn't tell you. Last night, when everyone was asleep, I secretly went to dig some out. I was afraid others might find out, so I didn't take out too many things, just enough for a few days. We can take out more slowly so that we can use it on normal days without arousing suspicion. As for these eggs, I found them on the field when I went to dig last night. I don't know which family's chicken was running wild and making nests. I saw 2 eggs in the nest and picked them up. After hearing Zhuang Qingning's explanation, Zhuang Qingsui finally understood, so, that's why. Yes, if anyone asks about this in the future, just say you don't know, okay? Zhuang Qingning instructed, keeping her head down the whole time and not daring to look in Zhuang Qingsui's eyes. It was a bit uneasy to deceive a child. Zhuang Qingsui did not notice, she completely believed in the words of her sister Zhuang Qingning. She nodded repeatedly, don't worry, sis. No matter who asks in the future, I will not mention this and I will definitely not let others know. Good girl. Zhuang Qingning patted her little head, hurry up and wash your face and hands, then get ready to eat. This egg drop porridge is best when served hot, it's not good when it's cold. All right. Zhuang Qingsui happily fetched water to wash her hands and face. After tidying up, she sat with Zhuang Qingning, holding her bowl and sipping the egg drop porridge. The porridge was smooth and sweet, with a faintly fragrant taste of flour mixed with the savory aroma of egg. Tasting a bite of the cornmeal pancake mixed with a hint of flour, this breakfast could be described as delicious. After the sisters finished eating, they both washed the bowls and the pot and tidied everything up. Let's go, Qingsui, we are going to Aunt Wen's house. Zhuang Qingning said. Go to Aunt Wen's house. Zhuang Qingsui widened her eyes, sis, isn't it said that Aunt Wen has a terrible temper, always scolding and beating people? What are we going there for? I have something to discuss with Aunt Wen about renting her tofu workshop. After that, if we can make tofu to sell, we will at least have a way to make a living. Zhuang Qingning answered, rest assured, I'm going to discuss business with her properly. Why would Aunt Wen scold or beat us for no reason? Well, despite being afraid of Aunt Wen, Zhuang Qingsui nodded as her sister was going, let's go. Let's go. Zhuang Qingning took Zhuang Qingsui's hand, and when they left, they took 2 of the pancakes made that morning, and headed towards Aunt Wen's house. Aunt Wen is Zhuang Xingxing's wife, Mrs. Wen. Mrs. Wen was a well-known figure in the village. Famous for her fierce temper. When she scolded people, she never repeated herself. She fought more fiercely than men, and even Zhuang Jingye, the village chief, was apprehensive about her and dared not provoke her lightly. Even many parents threatened disobedient children by saying that if they didn't behave, they would be sent to Aunt Wen's house. Chapter 8, 8008 Boasting. 8 Chapter 008 Boasting. Please add to your favorites list and recommend. Partly because of Aunt Wen's irascible temper, her 2 sons and daughter, who she had raised single-handedly since becoming a widow, had all left the village after they grew up. They couldn't bear to live in the same village as her. So Aunt Wen now lived alone, and her house was not far from the home of Butcher Hua, where Zhuang Qingning lived. It was also located at the entrance of the village. It was just a house away to the east. When they arrived at the entrance of Aunt Wen's house, the wooden gate was open. Is Aunt Wen at home? Zhuang Qingning called out loudly. There was no response from inside the courtyard. Is Aunt Wen at home? If you're looking for someone, why don't you go inside instead of standing at the entrance wailing like a ghost? If I don't respond, are you going to keep shouting? Those who know would know that you're looking for someone, but those who don't might think you're trying to bring the dead back to life. What a way to start the morning, who knows what kind of sin I may have committed. A barrage of scolding ensued, but Mrs. Wen was nowhere in sight. Zhuang Qingsui, scared, clung tightly to Zhuang Qingning's sleeve, hiding behind her without daring to show her face. Zhuang Qingning patted her hand to reassure her, then stepped into the courtyard and headed towards the hall. In the hall, Mrs. Wen was having breakfast on a stool. She was eating her cornmeal porridge with pickled mustard slowly and carefully. Aunt Wen, Zhuang Qingning greeted with a smile. Mrs. Wen glanced at Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui but quickly looked away, continuing to eat her pickles leisurely. I was wondering who it might be. It turns out to be Ning, the girl who just started a woman's household in our village. Aunt Wen, you knew about that? Zhuang Qingning was surprised. Only a few people might know about her status as a woman's household Zhuang Jingye had established for her this morning. Even Zhuang Rumen, judging by their inaction, probably didn't know yet and thought she had run away. Since her children moved away, Aunt Wen rarely went out. How did she know? In a village this small, people's business travels fast. Even a fart you'd let out in your courtyard would spread its stench throughout the village in no time. I'm neither deaf nor blind, so how could I miss something as significant as someone creating a woman's household? Mrs. Wen gave Zhuang Qingning a sidelong glance. It's been said that no one visits unless they're after something. You came all this way bright and early, so spill it, what's up? To be frank, there are two things I need to discuss with you, said Zhuang Qingning. Zhuang Qingning laughed. The first thing is, I want to rent your tofu workshop. After Zhuang Xingxing passed away, Mrs. Wen opened the tofu workshop. It was with this business that she was able to support her family and raise her 3 children. Only in recent years, after her children each moved out and Mrs. Wen got older, the workshop was shut down because it was too much for her to handle alone. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Wen paused her movement and glanced at Zhuang Qingning. So that's what you're after. I'm known for being forthright. Even if someone wants to buy my workshop, they might dream about it but never dare to open their mouth. You're the first one to dare speak about this openly to me. Before I agree or refuse, tell me about the second thing. The second thing is, this morning while I was cooking, I made these cornmeal pancakes. I think they taste pretty good, so I brought some over for you, Aunt Wen, Zhuang Qingning said, as she handed over the still warm pancakes. Mrs. Wen, not being the least bit polite, took them and took a bite, nodding slightly. Edible, but where did you get these? Mrs. Song is known to be stingy. Even if she allows you to cook, she'd measure the food herself. So how could you manage to pilfer food right under her nose? Well, of course, I have my ways, Zhuang Qingning responded with a smile. Indeed, every one of the 8 immortals has his own magic tricks. Mrs. Wen finished one of the pancakes, picked up another one, and continued eating. So, Aunt Wen, do you agree to rent me your tofu workshop? Zhuang Qingning asked. What's the deal? If I refuse, do I have to return these pancakes and can't eat them anymore? Mrs. Wen rolled her eyes. Of course not. Zhuang Qingning chuckled. When you ask someone for a favor, it's only right to show goodwill. Regardless of whether you agree or not, these pancakes were brought for you, Aunt Wen. Besides, if I gave these to you before asking you for the favor, I'd be taking advantage of your situation and pressuring you into agreeing. That's why I explained my intentions before presenting my gift. Whether you think it's appropriate and want to accept the gift or not is entirely up to you. No need to feel troubled because you've accepted a gift and feel awkward about how to handle the situation. Zhuang Qingning knew just how to act when trying to obtain someone's favor. She was assertive but in a mild-mannered way. You're a very interesting girl. Then Mrs. Wen continued, now let me ask you, why exactly do you want to rent my tofu workshop and why do you think I'd agree? Everyone in this village knows that I can be quite a hard nut to crack. This workshop is not just for anyone to rent. To put it bluntly, it all depends on my mood. If I'm happy, I'd even give it away. But if I'm not, even if an emperor came to me I wouldn't rent it. I want to rent your tofu workshop because my sister and I have neither land nor a livelihood. Making tofu could support us. As for why I think you'd agree. Zhuang Qingning flashed a grin, her eyebrows raised slightly. That's because, Aunt Wen, you and I are just alike. That's why I think you'd agree with me. The same kind of person. Mrs. Wen paused for a moment. After a while, she asked Zhuang Qingning again, and I can make tofu that tastes better than Aunt Wen's, Zhuang Qingning confidently answered. Mrs. Wen was stunned. This time, even Zhuang Qingsui, who had been hiding nervously behind Zhuang Qingning, was startled. The tofu from Mrs. Wen's workshop had always been renowned for its delicious taste. It was precisely because Mrs. Wen produced such tasty tofu, despite her sour disposition, the business flourished and even ended up closing a competing tofu workshop in a nearby village. Zhuang Qingning claimed that she could produce better tasting tofu than Mrs. Wen. Little girl, already spouting big words at such a young age. Mrs. Wen raised an eyebrow, staring directly at Zhuang Qingning, without bragging. No one in the 10 or so surrounding villages can make tofu that tastes better than mine. Chapter 9, 9009 Daughter resembles mother. 9 Chapter 009 Daughter resembles mother. You, a little girl, dare to claim you can grind better tasting tofu than me. If Aunt Wen doesn't believe me, why not give it a try? Zhuang Qingning laughed aloud. Why not let me grind a batch of tofu for Aunt Wen to taste? If the tofu I grind tastes good, you'll let me rent this tofu factory. If it doesn't taste good, then we'll drop the matter. How does that sound? At her words, Mrs. Wen burst into laughter. Her eyes slightly narrowed, her laugh exaggerated. She displayed none of the kindness expected of the elderly. Instead, there was a sense of harshness that was unnerving. Competing in this gamble with a 12 or 13-year-old girl, that's interesting. Mrs. Wen smirked. My tofu hot pot hasn't been used for a long time, so starting it up again isn't unacceptable. But let's be clear up front, if you can't make tofu that tastes better than mine, it's not as simple as just not renting the tofu factory. You'll have to leave my tofu factory, one step at a time, on your knees. Do you think that's acceptable? Agreed. Zhuang Qingning replied immediately, without hesitation. You're refreshingly decisive, unlike those who dilly-dally. Mrs. Wen took a sip from her bowl of porridge, then, sooner is better than later. You say you can grind better tasting tofu, I am eager to taste it. There are ready beans in the tofu factory. Clean up the grinding mill and let's start. Mrs. Wen instructed. Agreed. Zhuang Qingning complied and left with Zhuang Qingsui for the tofu factory. Despite being called a tofu factory, it was merely 2 large rooms in Mrs. Wen's house used for grinding tofu. Everything necessary was inside, but since it hadn't been used for a while, it was covered in a thick layer of dust. The sack of beans was leaning against the wall. Zhuang Qingsui untied the rope securing the sack and grabbed a handful of beans to examine in the dim light of the room. They were fine, well preserved. There were no signs of mold, spoilage, or insect infestation. She took the winnowing basket hanging nearby, used a small broom to sweep off the dust, and poured in a small sack of beans. Qingsui, sort the beans first. Discard the blackened and rotten ones in this little basket at the side. I'll clean this water tank used for soaking beans. The water tank hadn't been used for a long time, was covered in a thick layer of dirt, and needed thorough cleaning. Otherwise, the beans soaked in it might easily spoil. Zhuang Qingsui agreed and sat down on a small stool to meticulously sort the beans. The light in the room wasn't good enough, and she thought about going out to the courtyard to sort the beans. But remembering the state of Mrs. Wen's courtyard, she dismissed the idea and went back inside with the winnowing basket. But the light inside was really bad, and Zhuang Qingsui was worried that she might not clean the beans thoroughly. If the tofu turned out bad, she wouldn't be able to win over Mrs. Wen and rent the tofu factory. After pondering it for a while, Zhuang Qingsui finally decided to place the winnowing basket near the edge of the doorway and started sorting the beans carefully. Meanwhile, Zhuang Qingning placed the cleaned water tank properly, and tidied up all the tools needed for making tofu, including the large stove for cooking soy milk and the stone mill for grinding. Meanwhile, Zhuang Rumen's family was having their meal. Cornmeal pancakes, cornmeal paste, served with pickles. Mother, you put too much cornmeal in these pancakes, it's choking. My throat has been hurting recently, eating this irritates it more. Can you make me some white flour pancakes instead? Complained Zhuang Qinghe with a pout. Mother, my throat is also uncomfortable. Zhuang Yuanzhong echoed beside her. If everyone eats white flour, who will eat the cornmeal? Zhuang Rumen replied discontentedly, our farmland is limited, so we have only a small harvest. If we all eat white flour, how are we supposed to manage? Why can Big Brother enjoy white steamed buns every meal at the academy? Every time he comes home, he gets meat and scrambled eggs from Mom. We can't even have white flour pancakes. Zhuang Qinghe muttered discontentedly. Can you compare yourselves with your elder brother? Yuanren is studying in town, using his brain a lot. How can he study if he doesn't get to eat well? Zhuang Rumen continued, how can he pass the exams, make a name for himself, and bring glory to our family if he doesn't have the strength to study? Even if he makes a name for himself, he's the one doing it. What does it have to do with us? Why should we suffer just to support him? That's not how it should be. You, girl, why are you becoming more and more disrespectful with your words? Mrs. Song intervened, if your elder brother achieves success, doesn't that mean our family achieves success? Once your brother passes his starter exams, our family would have a scholar. Won't that make your marital matters easier to settle? Furthermore, if your elder brother really becomes a talented scholar or a jurin, or even an official, you would then be a rich man's daughter. You can then have endless delicacies to eat, clothes to wear, and when it comes to choosing a spouse, you could choose from well-off and distinguished families. Zhuang Rumen shot a sideways glance. Mrs. Song was generally dim-witted, but she was unusually astute in this matter. She demonstrated a rare spark of intelligence. A light bulb lit up in Zhuang Qinghe's head. That was true. In the future, she would be a rich man's daughter, so Brother Wenqing would definitely only have eyes for her and no one else. All right, I'll listen to my parents, Zhuang Qinghe continued with her meal, her face full of smiles. Like mother, like daughter. Zhuang Yuanzhong smirked and lowered his head to drink his cornmeal paste. After breakfast, complying with Zhuang Rumen's request from last night, Mrs. Song picked out about 10 eggs from a basket. 1 egg, 2 eggs, 3 eggs, 4 eggs, 5 eggs. Mrs. Song placed them in a small bamboo basket and handed them to Zhuang Rumen. Here, make it an auspicious number, 16 eggs. What do we need so many for? 10 is enough. Zhuang Rumen took out a few eggs and covered the basket with a cloth. Just stay home and wait for my message. Remember everything I said, understood? Yes, don't worry, head of the family. Mrs. Song had a wide grin on her face. But in reality, she had so many wrinkles on her face that none of her gentleness could be seen when she smiled. She's unbearable to look at. Zhuang Rumen swallowed the rest of the words he was about to deliver. Holding the basket, he hurried out of the door. He arrived at the village chief's house. The chief, Zhuang Jingye, was sipping tea in the courtyard. On seeing Zhuang Rumen enter, he spat out the tea leaves he had been chewing for a while onto the ground. It took him a full day to come around, which meant that the neighbors hadn't revealed anything. This Zhuang Rumen, allowing his wife to abuse his niece, it was simply intolerable to families that have daughters. That they weren't helping to hide Qingning was already a favor, let alone helping to find her. That was impossible. And he had been threatened by a little girl, pushing him, the respected village chief, into cleaning up this potential mess. Zhuang Jingye was annoyed and shot Zhuang Rumen an unfriendly glare. Zhuang Rumen initially arrived with a big smile on his face, but he was taken aback when he was met with an unfriendly glare, which instantly dampened his spirit. Chapter 10, 10-0-10, Pretending. 10 Chapter 0-10, Pretending. But when she thought about it carefully, she really couldn't figure out what she had done to offend Zhuang Jingye. Zhuang Qingning could only attribute it to his possibly bad mood and became even more focused on dealing with the situation. "Uncle, have some tea," Zhuang Rumen said obsequiously. Instead of calling him village chief, he referred to him as uncle according to their seniority, hoping to close the gap between them. "I'm not blind, can't I see that I'm drinking tea? What do you think I should drink, rat poison?" Zhuang Jingye replied, irritated. "Oh, uncle, you must be joking, ha, stammered Zhuang Rumen, completely thrown off guard. His face flushed awkwardly. What a idiot. Zhuang Jingye resisted the urge to kick him and glared at him. "Enough of that. What's the matter that requires you to seek me out early in the morning?" "Well, our hens have been laying more eggs these days. So, I was thinking, you're always working hard managing the whole village, you must need something to replenish your strength. So, I picked a few of the freshest eggs to bring to you. You can ask Mrs. Song to make egg tea for you. It's convenient and tasty." With a smirk on his face, Zhuang Rumen placed the basket of eggs on a small tea table. Who really knows if these eggs are good or not, or whether they replenish strength? But one thing is for sure, you, Zhuang Rumen, you're so cunning. Zhuang Jingye glanced at Zhuang Rumen. Get to the point. Having his motives blatantly pointed out made Zhuang Rumen flushed with embarrassment. He chuckled awkwardly and said, "Uncle, I'll be honest with you. 2 of my nieces, Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui, ran away from home." "Oh. They ran away. Why?" Zhuang Jingye leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "Ah, it's all my fault, I didn't pay much attention to them before. As girls, they usually stay with Mrs. Song. But unexpectedly, Mrs. Song is nice to them in front of me but treats them harshly behind my back. I was aware of Mrs. Song's bad temper. She may not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but she's definitely hot-tempered. I was also worried about her not treating my nieces well. But, whenever I asked them how they were, they said they were well-fed and well-dressed, so I didn't suspect anything. Yesterday, I overheard Qingning arguing with Mrs. Song, saying she was unhappy about the houses and farmland being given to our family instead of her and Qingsui. I even promised to give them the profits from the farmland as their dowry. It's a rule, if the family doesn't have a male heir, the daughter can't inherit the property, but instead, it's passed along to the brother who has a male heir. It's typical for me, as their uncle, to collect these things. It's totally justified. I took away their properties, but in return, the profits are given to them as their dowry, which I think is quite reasonable. However, Qingning and Qingsui wouldn't listen to me and kept stubbornly asking for the farmland and houses. So I stopped speaking, thinking they would understand once they've given some thought. But instead, they quietly disappeared. The world outside the village is chaotic. These girls are inexperienced and have nothing to survive on the streets. Besides dealing with hardships, I dread the thought of them encountering any bad people out there. How am I supposed to face my deceased brother and sister-in-law? Zhuang Rumen tried to hold back his tears. I've been anxiously looking for them everywhere with Mrs. Song, but we haven't found them. I asked people in the village, but no one seemed to have seen them. Finally, with no other options, I come to you, hoping you might help us make some inquiries. If anyone sees them, they might inform us, and we can find the girls soon. Having finished speaking, he lowered his head and wiped the corner of his eyes. Looking at him, he seems like a genuinely concerned uncle. Zhuang Jingye inwardly cursed. What a phony. What argument? What claims to property? When Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui came to him for establishing a registry for unmarried women, they didn't mention a word about it. They clearly knew the rules and had no intention of seizing what's not rightfully theirs. And yet you're here falsely accusing them of breaking the rules. And pretending not to know about Mrs. Song's misdeeds, claiming you couldn't get the truth out of the girls, you're clearly pushing all the blame onto Mrs. Song and the girls, keeping yourself perfectly innocent. Everyone in the village knows Mrs. Song is selfish and ill-tempered, often causing quarrels with others, but she is surprisingly submissive to her husband, which is you, Zhuang Rumen. If you had disallowed it earlier, would she dare to abuse the girls so recklessly? You clearly knew and even instigated it, but in the end, you shifted all the blame onto Mrs. Song. You portray yourself as pitiful and innocent. Such hypocrisy and selfishness are most detestable. What's even more detestable is that you take others for idiots and think you can deceive me, the wise and observant village chief, with just a few words. You are so wrong, thinking you could deceive me with your tricks. Zhuang Jingye scoffed. Actually, if you want to find Qingning and Qingsui, it's not difficult. Uncle, do you have a way to find them? Zhuang Rumen was overjoyed. He knew it was the best decision to ask Zhuang Jingye for help. These eggs were, indeed, worth it. Well, it's not really a solution, but yesterday, Qingning and Qingsui didn't go anywhere else but came to me for help. Zhuang Jingye glanced at Zhuang Rumen. They wanted me to help them with something. Did they come to Zhuang Jingye to complain? Zhuang Rumen's heart sank. These two audacious girls. As soon as I find them, I will have Mrs. Song straighten them up. Uncle, they must have complained a lot about us. But whatever they said is just one side of the story. I hope you won't take it too seriously. They might be resentful because of the farmland issue and are probably saying whatever they want now, and LT/P, Chapter 11, 11:011 quite good. 11 Chapter 011 quite good. Thankfully the lie was spun earlier. Now whether Zhuang Qingning or Zhuang Qingsui filed a complaint, he would be able to return them unfazed. Zhuang Rumen really thought himself quite cunning. However, not a single complaint has been lodged, added Zhuang Jingye. Then, Zhuang Rumen looked puzzled. Why did they come? They came seeking to establish themselves as separate households, Zhuang Jingye solemnly responded. What? Zhuang Rumen stood there as if stupefied, thunderstruck into stillness. On this side, sisters Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui were solely focusing on making tofu. Once the beans were sorted, the tofu workshop had also been tidied up properly. All the tools necessary for grinding tofu were washed clean, a stark difference from the layers of dust that had accumulated earlier. After cleaning up, the first step of tofu making began, soaking the beans. They started adding water to the barrel of beans. The beans needed to be soaked until they were completely saturated and soft all the way through. The time needed for soaking depended on the ambient temperature. Since it was the peak of springtime, it would roughly take 10 hours to soak through the soybeans. By that calculation, it would be almost pitch dark in the night. After the beans were soaked, and some other tasks completed, it was almost time for lunch. The two sisters' stomachs rumbled with hunger. At this time, Mrs. Wen had already started eating her lunch. It was soup made from flour, with spinach and garlic added in, and the aroma was enticing. "There's no meal prepared for you. If you're hungry, go home and cook." Mrs. Wen slurped down her noodles, casting a disdainful glance at Zhuang Qingning. "Aunt Wen, now that we've soaked the beans, it should take us well into the evening to finish. We'll leave for now and come back later in the night," smiled Zhuang Qingning. "If you want to leave, leave. What's with the long explanation? It's annoying. Are you implying that this old lady doesn't know how long it takes for these beans to soak?" Mrs. Wen curled her lips, impatiently retorting, "Just leave quickly. We'll take our leave then." Knowing about Mrs. Wen's temperament through the original host's memories, Zhuang Qingning didn't say much. She merely took Zhuang Qingsui's hand and walked out of Mrs. Wen's home. Stepping out of the threshold, Zhuang Qingsui recollected her breath. "Aunt Wen is indeed very fierce. She's intimidating. Fiercer than our grandaunt." Zhuang Qingning responded with a smile. She's more intimidating." Zhuang Qingsui nodded, an earnest look on her small face. "Grandaunt is scary, but it's more because we fear the stick in her hand, that she won't feed us." But with Aunt Wen just sitting there, without uttering a single offensive word, she managed to intimidate people. Even though you know she won't lift a hand to hit you or verbally abuse you, she makes you particular about not offending her, lest you face her wrath. After all, there won't be any good results. Zhuang Qingsui understood this principle but was unable to articulate it due to her young age. She merely stated, "Anyway, just looking at her makes me afraid, and I dare not provoke her." "I actually think Aunt Wen has a good temperament," Zhuang Qingning said as she smiled, musing Zhuang Qingsui's hair. "What?" Zhuang Qingsui's jaw almost dropped to the floor. She was so fierce and even slightly derogatory, but more importantly, she was intimidating. Zhuang Qingsui didn't even dare to glance at her while she was working just now. How could Aunt Wen, as fierce as she was, have a good temperament? Seeing that Zhuang Qingsui obviously misunderstood her, Zhuang Qingning laughed. "When I say Aunt Wen has a good temperament, I don't mean that it's good for others. I mean that it's good for her, especially so." "What do you mean, sister? I don't understand," Zhuang Qingsui replied with confusion all over her face. "How should I explain this to you?" Zhuang Qingning thought for a moment, then said, "Let's say there's a flower that's very fragrant, very beautiful, and edible, and can be used medicinally. Would you like to pluck it and bring it home?" Of course. Such a useful flower, of course, she would want to bring it home. But what if this flower were very fragrant and very beautiful, but full of thorns, and its fragrance possibly poisonous? Would you dare to pluck it then? "I wouldn't dare, Zhuang Qingsui shook her head vigorously. "Wouldn't you walk around it when you see it?" "Of course I would walk around it." "That's it. Aunt Wen is like this, fierce and prickly. If you provoke her, you'll get stung all over, and possibly even get poisoned. This being the case time and again, naturally, everyone knows not to take her lightly or provoke her." Zhuang Qingning further elaborated, "Since they don't dare to provoke her, they naturally wouldn't dare to bully her either, thereby freeing her from many troubles and letting her lead a peaceful life. It was especially suitable for someone like Mrs. Wen, a widow in her middle age, raising a few children on her own. If she were weak and timid, outsiders would not take her seriously. Just like how Zhuang Xingxing's brothers would constantly pick on her over trivial matters, not to mention those outside who disregarded the plights of widows and orphans. Mrs. Luwen was brutal and scary, so everyone was afraid to provoke her. Thus, she was free from many troubles and outsiders were unlikely to bully her or take advantage of her. This kind of temperament was indeed best suited for Mrs. Wen. Perhaps, she thought the same way, which was why she acted so harshly and kept others at a distance. "I think I understand what you mean, sister. We can't show any weakness going forward or else others may feel that we're easy to bully." Zhuang Qingsui said earnestly, "We must be like a hedgehog, with quills spanning the whole body so others dare not touch us lightly." "That's what I mean," Zhuang Qingning laughed. "Are you hungry?" As soon as she finished speaking, a sharp rumbling noise emerged from Zhuang Qingsui's stomach. Feeling somewhat embarrassed, she covered her ears. I am hungry. How about we also have noodles for lunch? Zhuang Qingning suggested with a smile. We can mix in some cornmeal with the white flour and make hand-pulled noodles. Sure. Zhuang Qingsui nodded her head vigorously. It was time for lunch and they decided to have noodles. As the sun was almost directly overhead, they needed to hurry back and make the noodles. They had gotten enough salt and oil from Little Five to season the noodles. Zhuang Qingning led Zhuang Qingsui to the nearby fields where they picked a bit of shepherd's purse, wild garlic, and other herbs as accompaniments for their noodles. Zhuang Qingsui was lucky enough to spot a quail nest in a nearby bush, and managed to collect a few quail eggs. Resultantly, 2 bowls of hot and fragrant shepherd's purse and wild garlic with a few quail eggs mixed into the noodles made of cornmeal and white flour were ready. Everyone had a large bowl filled to the brim. The quantity was plentiful and the taste delightful, making it a great meal. Chapter 12, 12-0-12, Why Don't You Rob? 12 Chapter 0-12, Why Don't You Rob? This lunch was truly a satisfying one. Soaking the beans would take a considerable amount of time, and they would need to be ground into tofu in the evening, leaving no time for proper sleep. Therefore, Zhuang Qingning decided to take Zhuang Qingsui to sleep. Sister, Zhuang Qingsui said, laying in bed with a furrowed brow. Those beans, are you sure they will be okay without us watching over them? The beans will soak up the water on their own, there's no need to keep an eye on them continuously. But, sister, you said this morning that we could make even tastier tofu. I noticed Antwon looked upset, almost angry. What if she is resentful and sabotages our beans in order to prevent us from making good tofu? Zhuang Qingsui sat up. Why don't I go guard the pot of soaking beans? It will put my mind at ease. You're going alone. Wait, are you not afraid of Antwon anymore? Zhuang Qingning teased, laughing. Scared, Zhuang Qingsui shrunk back at the mention, but even if she was scared, she had to go. Protecting the beans for Zhuang Qingning's tofu was her top priority. All right, chuckling at Zhuang Qingsui's anxious yet determined look, Zhuang Qingning hugged her sister's neck. Just trust me, Antwon wouldn't do such a thing. Antwon may have a bad temper and appear intimidating, but in all these years, have you ever heard of Antwon sabotaging anyone? Or shortchanging anyone while selling tofu? Zhuang Qingsui shook her head. Honestly speaking, over the years, she only heard about Antwen's toughness and foul mouth. She had never heard of her being underhanded in her business. Zhuang Qingning explained, craftsmen always strive to improve their skills. When they encounter something better than what they can make, they seek to learn from it. Antwon is no exception. Knowing that someone could make better tasting tofu, she naturally would want to see and taste it for herself to figure out the secret of making it. Didn't you notice that Antwen's eyes lit up when I mentioned that we could make better tofu? She was so eager to try the tofu we are going to make. So, go to sleep at ease, Antwon won't sabotage us. After hearing Zhuang Qingning's explanation, Zhuang Qingsui found it reasonable and laid down peacefully. Children get tired quickly. In the past, she was always busy working all the time under Zhuang Rumen and Mrs. Song, never getting enough sleep. Now, being allowed to sleep as much as she wanted, she quickly dozed off after lying down. Seeing Zhuang Qingsui's even breathing, Zhuang Qingning softly called out a couple of times. Getting no reaction, she quietly left the bed, exited the room, and entered the courtyard. The courtyard, now free of weeds and desolation, was perfectly neat. Zhuang Qingning pulled up a homemade bench and sat in the yard, basking in the warm and comforting sunlight. However, she didn't have the luxury to enjoy the leisure time as she was busy summoning Xiaowu. Host, what can I do for you? How many hard working points do I have now? Host, you currently have 9 hard working points. Deducting 1 point needed for the normal operation of the system, you have a remaining 8 points. The items you can exchange are listed as follow. Since the host has not yet solved the subsistence problem, you can enjoy a discount if you exchange for clothing and bedding now. Wait a moment. She worked all day yesterday, and she only earned 8 points, all of which were used to exchange for items. This morning, she had already gained 9 points. How is this possible? The number of hard-working points are determined by all factors of the work done by the host. In addition to normal labor like cooking and cleaning up the tofu workshop, the host's activities such as planning for the future, preparing for preliminary negotiations, which are for the purpose of winning more hard-working points in the future, can also generate hard-working points. So, in the future, I can just lay there daydreaming and generate a large number of hard-working points to exchange for all kinds of things, and thus reach the peak of my life. Host, wake up. In terms of planning for the future and aimless daydreaming, the system can make precise judgments. Host, please do not harbor illusions about exploiting system bugs. Fine then. It seems this system, which has suffered from the harshness of society, doesn't allow her any loopholes to exploit. Zhuang Qingning shrugged, then looked over the list of exchangeable items. In addition to daily food, bedding, indeed, there was a discount. The most common coarse cloth spring outfit only required 2 hard-working points, and a regular thickness quilt needed only 4 hard-working points. However, because it was a discount deal, it could only be exchanged once. In order to prevent the host from being suspected in this world and exposing the existence of the system, the clothing and bedding prepared by the system have been made to look old and unremarkable. Host, please feel free to redeem. That's considerate, but... Hey, Xiaowu, do you have any secret tofu-making recipes or something? In her previous life, Zhuang Qingning, living in the modern era, was very interested in traditional crafts, especially tofu making. She had researched the process in detail and had even tried her hand at the craft. After reincarnating, during the New Year period, Mrs. Song would have Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui make tofu. They were quite skilled at it. With the skills she possessed, she could make decent tofu. However, she could not be sure that the tofu she would produce would be awe-inspiringly delicious or even able to compete with Aunt Wen's. If she wanted to use tofu making as a way to pave a rich future, the tofu she initially made must have an absolute competitive edge. For this, Xiaowu's ability was required. After all, didn't a certain system claim to be super capable? Yes, there's a basic tofu production recipe. Once redeemed, it will unlock the basic tofu production secret recipe. So, host, before you made this bet with Aunt Wen, you didn't have any certain winning tactic and just said things without thinking. His host was extremely bold, wasn't she? Well, it's not entirely without basis. There's a little bit to it, but to be 100% sure, it's always better to be safe. Moreover, if the host does everything, won't it make you, the system, appear useless? It's the first time I've ever seen a host depict reliance on the system in such a refreshing way. This can be attributed to me being your first host. Once you have more hosts, you'll find out that there are all kinds of hosts. Serious face. Alright, let's not talk about that. There is a basic tofu production recipe, but, the price for redemption is 666 hard-working points. Isn't that a heist? Zhuang Qingning rolled her eyes prominently. By her current rate of earning hard-working points, even if she earned 10 points a day, it would take over 2 months. If she waited until she had amassed that many hard-working points before redeeming the tofu recipe, the golden opportunity would have already passed. Chapter 13, 13-013 Empty Glove White Wolf, Qingyun list added more. 13 Chapter 013 Empty Glove White Wolf, Qingyun list added more. The price of the recipes is high because it's like a one-time buyout. After purchasing a basic recipe, there's no need to buy a higher level one. Once a certain proficiency level is reached, it can automatically upgrade. Also, the basic tofu making recipe you unlock doesn't require any additional diligence points to purchase, stock is automatically refreshed, so overall, it's very cost-effective. Cost-effective it may be, but the key problem is she can't afford it right now. After Zhuang Qingning furrowed her brow and plucked out 2 strands of hair, she blinked her eyes. How about, we negotiate? What do you suggest? Zhuang Qingning's lips curled up slightly, her eyes squinting. How about you lend me 666 diligence points southwest I can exchange for this tofu recipe? Once I've earned enough diligence points, I'll pay you back. How does that sound? Get something for nothing? Absolutely not. Don't reject it so quickly. You said it yourself, you only succeed if your host does. So, we're really in this together. Right now I'm stuck. I can only do some basic labor works, which gives me low diligence points and little money. If I'm dreaming of getting rich, could I really rely only on dreams? If you loosen up a bit and lend me some points, I can get the recipe and lease the tofu shop. Once I start making tofu, my diligence points will multiply in no time. Becoming rich will no longer be just a dream. Anyway, if you don't want to lend me the diligence points, then be prepared to see your host live in poverty for the rest of her life. After a long sweet talk from Zhuang Qingning, she even made a few threats in the end. However, all she got was a long silence. Oh, forget it, no loan, it doesn't matter. Just remember, the so-called strong system that can't even figure this out, when you get other hosts in the future, don't brag about being powerful again. Otherwise, you would just be making a fool of yourself. If persuasion doesn't work, try threats. If threats don't help, provoke their pride. Zhuang Qingning thought all of these tactics were worth a try, at least one of them might work. You wait a moment. Still need to think it over. This deal is beneficial to us both, there's no need for any hesitation. Trust me, as long as you approve of this request, you will soon become a system that achieves its goals, reaching the pinnacle of your success. Wait for what? Time is of the essence, the more you delay, the more time you waste. Every second is precious, as a system, don't you realize this? Host, can you please be quiet for a moment? You're disturbing my calculations. Fine. Zhuang Qingning immediately silenced herself. A while later, a screen in Zhuang Qingning's brain lit up again. A scroll-like item appeared and slowly began to glow. Congratulations to the host for obtaining the item, Basic Tofu Recipe, and unlocking the exchange item, Basic Tofu Production Secret Recipe. In an instant, Zhuang Qingning felt there was more information in her brain, and an additional item was added in her redeemable goods column. The Basic Tofu Production Secret Recipe. Add 1 drop in the production of a whole piece of tofu, a bottle contains 10 drops, free to exchange. Stock is refreshed every 10 hours, unable to manually refresh. Zhuang Qingning immediately exchanged for a bottle and along with it 2 old-style half-new coarse cloth clothes, a thin quilt, and finally, with her remaining diligence points, she exchanged for some white vinegar. Everything is ready. Zhuang Qingning packed up these items, a smile curling at the corners of her mouth. Host, remember to return the system's diligence points in time. Otherwise, the whole system might experience a bug, which would affect the host's path to wealth. In severe cases, it could even endanger the host's life. Relax, I still have some integrity left. Xiaowu wanted to say something, but stopped himself, choosing instead to quickly leave. Zhuang Qingning tidied things up and went into the house to sleep. This nap lasted until the sun began to set and the western sky was dotted with clouds. Zhuang Qingning finally woke up, stretching lazily. Seeing the thin quilt covering her and the clothes nearby, Zhuang Qingning was instantly energized. Sister, did you get more stuff again? She asked. Huh? Zhuang Qingning suddenly remembered the lie she had earlier told Zhuang Qingsui and nodded hurriedly. Yes, I got a couple of spring clothes and a quilt. These clothes are probably altered from half-worn clothes that Mom used to wear. The material is not that new, but mine fits me well. Try yours. Zhuang Qingning quickly shifted the topic. The winter clothes she was wearing were randomly given to her by Mrs. Song last winter. They were old clothes previously worn by Zhuang Qinghe, patched several times. After a winter's wear and washing, even the patches were worn out. So, for any new clothes, even if they were half new, as long as they were hers, Zhuang Qingsui would be extremely excited, quickly changing into them with high spirits. Not bad, it fits just right. After trying it on, Zhuang Qingsui adjusted the clothes hem, happily saying, my parents really thought things through, everything is prepared so thoroughly. Isn't that the truth? Our parents lived for many years, the salt they ate is more than the food we had, naturally their consideration was thorough. But your clothes are really nice, the sleeves are the right length, and the size fits well. Zhuang Qingning laughed and said, with this said, taking it out now is just the right moment. If we were any later, you might have grown taller and not be able to wear it. That's right. Zhuang Qingsui nodded earnestly, but, sister, be more careful next time you get something, it's best not to be seen by others. Rest assured, that place is very secluded, and nobody goes there on ordinary days. Everyone was working in the fields when I went. Nobody saw me. Zhuang Qingning lied again to fob off her sister, then quickly shifted the topic, that's enough about that, let's get up quickly and cook. After eating, we'll tidy up and it'll be time to go to Aunt Wen's. Okay. Zhuang Qingsui quickly folded the quilt and tidied her clothes, then followed Zhuang Qingning to cook. The flour they got from the system wasn't much, but they had plenty of cornmeal. For dinner, they cooked cornmeal porridge and then stuck some cornmeal pancakes around the pot's edge. Because they had to work through the night here and probably wouldn't have time to go home and cook in the morning, they prepared a few extra pancakes to save for later. For vegetables, they cold mixed some shepherd's purse foraged from the field at noon with wild garlic. With this, they had pancakes, soup, and vegetables for dinner. Miss Ning, Miss Sui. When the two were eating, Mrs. He came in. Mrs. He, or Aunt He, was the wife of Zhuang Yonghe in the village. She was in her 30s and previously close to Zhuang Qingning's family. She often cared about the two sisters when they were first adopted by Zhuang Rumen and Mrs. Song, and spoke up for them. Aunt He, how come you're here? Zhuang Qingning was quite surprised to see her. I only heard today that you two have become independent households and temporarily live here, so I came to visit. Mrs. He took out a cloth bag, and I brought you some cornmeal. It's not much, but it should be enough for you to eat for a few days. He sighed. The harvest this year wasn't great, and Xiaoxi constantly needs medicine. Things are tight at home, so I can't help you much. Why would you say such a thing, Auntie? At this point, you still care about us, and we are very grateful, said Zhuang Qingning. Indeed, they were very grateful. In her current situation, with no farm, no money, and the likelihood of nobody employing them, others considered her a bottomless abyss. In such circumstances, Mrs. He still taking the initiative to help was already a significant kindness. Furthermore, as she had said, her youngest son was often ill, and her family was also struggling. This cornmeal is a bit much, Auntie. Why? Don't you leave us half, suggested Zhuang Qingning. How would that be enough? There are two of you. Keeping half would not be enough. Don't stand on ceremony with me, keep it all. If you run out of anything in the future, as long as we can supply it, just come and get it from us. Any vegetables in the field can be eaten. Just pick them. Afraid that Zhuang Qingning was too shy to accept, Mrs. He put the bag down. All right, it's also getting late. You two should tidy up and go to bed early. I'll head back first. With that, she walked away without looking back, ignoring Zhuang Qingning's calls for her to stay. Auntie is really nice. Zhuang Qingsui's eyes welled up with tears, and she couldn't help but sniffle. Yes. Zhuang Qingning agreed wholeheartedly. Since it's Auntie's wish, let's keep it for now. When we are more prosperous in the future, we will just be more filial to uncle and auntie. Zhuang Qingsui nodded firmly. The sisters put away the things that Mrs. He had brought, wrapped up 2 cornmeal pancakes they had made for the night, and by this time, it was already dark outside. Chapter 14, 14:014 Touching on a Sore Spot. 14 Chapter 014 Touching on a Sore Spot. When the two of them arrived at Mrs. Wen's house, she had already finished eating and lit the lamp. You are so late, I thought you two were unable to make better tofu and had run off, Mrs. Wen teased with a tug at the corner of her mouth. We figured that the beans need to be soaked for a long time, so we have come a bit late, Zhuang Qingning said with a smile. Aunt, you should rest early, we will go and get busy. We will try to keep the noise down tonight, so as not to disturb your sleep. You two are not entirely foolish if you realize this much. With a light tone, Mrs. Wen continued, when you get old, every sleep feels light. If you are dropping and banging things in the background, I truly can't sleep. So, be a bit cautious not to disturb my sleep. Having said that, Mrs. Wen returned to her room. Zhuang Qingning went into the tofu workshop, fetched a strainer, scooped out some beans from the water tank, picked a few randomly, and checked the condition of the soaked beans. The beans had swollen upon soaking water, they had grown in size, and every bean had entirely lost its hardness inside. This was a symbol of the beans being thoroughly soaked. She called Zhuang Qingsui to bring the strainer and the basket to scoop up the beans, and Zhuang Qingning started the first step of tofu production, grinding into soy milk. The beans were added to the stone mill through the holes. Upon turning the stone mill, the thick white soy milk gradually flowed out from the gaps in the stone mill, fell into the stone plate beneath the mill, gathered there, and flowed into a wooden barrel underneath through the holes on the edges. Making soy milk was the most time-consuming and labor-intensive task. And in the past, when Mrs. Wen's family still had a tofu workshop, they had a donkey at home that did the laborious task of turning the stone mill. Now that there were no animals to assist, Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui had to grind the soaked beans into milk by themselves. At this time, everyone in Zhuang Rumen's family was having dinner. Having dinner at this time was considered late. The light of their oil lamp was not only dim but also consumed oil quickly. This was why most farmers usually have dinner before dark, then they go to bed early. This practice allows them to start their day early the next morning, and it also saves some money that would otherwise be spent on oil or candles. Mrs. Song originally did not want to consume the oil lamp's oil, but she had no choice. There was more than 10 acres of farmland in their house that needed tending. But to hoe over it once took several days. At this time, they also had to spread chicken manure, water the fields, and there was simply too much work to be done. There were also the vegetable plots. Right now was the time to plant cucumbers, mung beans, and other crops. They didn't even have time to do this. If they delayed it any more, they would miss the season, and there would be no vegetables to eat in the summer. In the past, Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui were like two old oxen. They worked tirelessly, ate little, and helped Mrs. Song to live a more relaxed life. But now, without these two, even if Zhuang Qinghe and Zhuang Yuanzhong were called upon, they wouldn't be as efficient nor productive. They could not get much work done. After finishing the work in the fields, they had to hurry back to cook. In such a rush, they were inevitably a bit late for the meal. Be more efficient tomorrow, and don't have dinner this late. Do not waste the oil lamp. Zhuang Rumen slurped a mouthful of cornmeal porridge, said, "The lamp oil is not going to last, and the smell is also not pleasant." "Yes. I understand." Mrs. Song nodded repeatedly, then turned towards Zhuang Qinghe. "Qinghe, come back early tomorrow and prepare dinner ahead of time. From what I see, you are not very productive in the fields, so you might as well come back early and cook. At least, I wouldn't have to worry about it once I get back." Hearing this, Zhuang Qinghe frowned tightly. In the field, she could slack off without being noticed due to the crowd. However, now that Mrs. Song had entrusted her with the task of cooking, wouldn't she have no opportunity to be lazy? What's more, the smoke from cooking had dried her face, and her skin is no longer soft. Washing pots, doing dishes, and starting fires had roughened her fingers, making them unappealing. Upon thinking about the possibility of becoming ugly because of this, Zhuang Qinghe immediately began to sulk. All this work used to be done by those two wretched girls. Why do I have to do it now? Why on earth would you bring this up? Mrs. Song immediately fell pale, quickly pinched Zhuang Qinghe to keep her silent, and cast a worried glance at Zhuang Rumen. Since Zhuang Rumen came back from the village chief Zhuang Jingye's house in the morning, he had been angry all day, hardly looking at her. Indeed, upon hearing that Zhuang Qingning had declared Zhuang Qingsui as part of her household, meaning, henceforth, they would have no relations with their family. She would no longer be able to verbally or physically punish them or order them to do chores. Not only Zhuang Rumen but also Mrs. Song was furious about it. But she was not entitled to be angry. Zhuang Rumen had already scolded her thoroughly. He criticized her for being impatient and reckless in her actions on an average day. She had forced two good old oxen to leave. Mrs. Song knew that she had been wrong and had caused trouble. She dared not utter a word as Zhuang Rumen scolded and blamed her relentlessly. It was only with great difficulty that they reached this moment when Zhuang Rumen, tired of scolding, chose to say no more about the matter as it couldn't be reversed now. All Mrs. Song hoped was for Zhuang Rumen to tame his anger and let the matter pass. But Zhuang Qinghe just had to bring it up unwisely. Wasn't this adding fuel to the fire, making her feel even more annoyed and also upsetting Zhuang Rumen? Originally, Zhuang Qinghe was unhappy about having to cook. Now, feeling the pain on her arm where she had been pinched, her anger flared, and she began to cry, "It's indeed the case, it's all your mother's fault. If it weren't for her forcing those two wretched girls away, why would I be the one doing all this work?" The more you say, the more absurd it gets. Afraid, anxious, and angry that Zhuang Qinghe was not understanding her hints, Mrs. Song could only scold, "Why are you bringing up this issue? Can't you, as a grown girl, do some work? Why can't the mistakes my mother made be mentioned? It is indeed her fault. If not for her, I wouldn't have to do so many chores, I wouldn't have to be this tired." The more Zhuang Qinghe talked, the more aggrieved she felt, and her crying only intensified. With snot and tears everywhere. Mrs. Song was both pained and irritated by the sight. Bang! The chopsticks in Zhuang Rumen's hands hit the table. Can't even have a peaceful meal, not one of you is useful. All you know is to cry, cry, cry. What are you crying for? Are you attending a funeral? I'm still alive. If you can do the work, do it. If you can't do it, get out. I won't keep idlers at home. Following Zhuang Rumen's angry scolding, he stood up abruptly and went inside the house. Left in the room were Mrs. Song, Zhuang Qinghe, and Zhuang Yuanzhong, none of them daring to breathe out loud. Especially Zhuang Qinghe, she didn't dare to cry out loud, only suppressing sobs and wiping her tears. Look at you making your father angry. And you're still crying. At this moment, Mrs. Song felt resentment towards Zhuang Qinghe. She reached out and tapped her on the forehead. What nonsense are you carrying in your brain? Always bringing up the irrelevant matters. Chapter 15, 15-015, Not Daring. 15 Chapter 015, Not Daring. What I said wasn't wrong. It was all due to the negligence of mother. If she hadn't pressed those two stupid girls so hard, why would I have to cook? Zhuang Qinghe continued to sob. These past few days, I've been cooking and working non-stop. Look at my hands, they're filled with blisters. Mrs. Song glanced at Zhuang Qinghe's palm, noticing visible signs of soreness. Compassion welled up in her heart. Under normal circumstances, these tasks would have been done by the two troublesome girls. Her daughter should never have been burdened this way. Now that the pair had abruptly usurped their duties and established a separate household, all the chores had fallen onto her daughter. How could this even make sense? After all, the blame rests squarely on those two preposterous girls. If they hadn't been so reckless and gone off to establish a separate household, things at home would have remained peaceful. How did it come to this predicament, with her becoming so despised by Zhuang Rumen? Mrs. Song looked into the house with growing concern. The steamed cornbread in her hand was getting unpalatable by the minute. After pacifying Zhuang Qinghe and Zhuang Yuanzhong for dinner, Mrs. Song tidied up and brought cornmeal paste along with the cornbread into the house. She put on a brave face and said, "My dear, you worked hard all day. You need to eat something to keep your strength up. I fried peanuts for you, eat with that, have some." Zhuang Rumen returned in a huff not so long ago, and by now, his stomach was demanding food. Ignoring Mrs. Song, he took the food and started eating. Seeing this, Mrs. Song's apprehension eased. She sat down by the bed and began to cautiously lower her voice. "Dear, Qinghe is still young and ignorant, don't be too hard on her. As for this situation, I know that it's my fault. In the past, I treated them the same way and they never dared to complain. They didn't dare to mutter a word. Who would have imagined that these two would gather the courage to petition the village chief in favor of establishing a female household?" Zhuang Rumen felt the peanuts in his mouth lose their flavor. He gave Mrs. Song an annoyed look. Who would have known that you could be so foolish? Life has become unbearable. They kept quiet until now because they still thought they could tolerate it. What were they supposed to do when they couldn't handle it anymore? Who could have guessed? It seems that even a pig could figure it out, but not you. As she noticed Zhuang Rumen's darkening face, Mrs. Song was too scared to continue her rambling. Instead, she quickly changed the subject. "Dear, I'm not saying that I remain entirely blameless, but what those girls did was wrong too. But in any case, we must figure out a way, dear. We can't just let it end this way, right? What else can we do?" Zhuang Rumen sulkily shot back at Mrs. Song. "Didn't I tell you what Zhuang Jingye, that old bastard, said when I came back this morning? Didn't he say that since those two imbeciles have established their own household, from that point on, they wouldn't have any relation with our family? That we should close our doors and live our lives peacefully, and if there is any dispute among neighbors, he, the village chief, will not refrain from mediating. Isn't this just a warning that we should stop bothering those two stupid girls?" His words were completely flawed. So what if they've established a separate household? They are still of the Zhuang family, our own nieces. Blood is thicker than water. Mrs. Song was disgruntled. "As elders, don't we even have the right to scold them?" "Of course, you do, and that old bastard also stated that if we cause any troubles for those two reckless girls and stir up a commotion, he will not intervene but go directly to Master Kohan's high." Zhuang Rumen said, grinning wryly. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Song's face turned pale. Kohansai is a school in the town. The school was donated by a generous person surnamed Chow, and was specifically for gifted students. The teachers here are all scholars, and the tuition fees are half that of other schools. Kohan's High School does not discriminate based on age or economic status. It only looks at whether the student is academically capable, intelligent, studious, and whether there are endorsements from the village chief or local gentry, and whether their conduct and family traditions are appropriate. Zhuang Rumen and Mrs. Song's eldest son, Zhuang Yuanren, is quite intelligent and eager to learn. He was recommended by Zhuang Jingye to study at Kohan's High, and this year, he passed the county examination and is preparing for the prefecture-level examination. If that old devil Zhuang Jingye stirs up unnecessary trouble by going to Master Kohan's High, uttering all sorts of nonsense, then Zhuang Yuanren will definitely not be allowed to study at Kohan's High anymore, effectively derailing his future prospects. The one thing that Zhuang Rumen and Mrs. Song do not joke about is Zhuang Yuanren's studies. For such a trifling matter, the village chief sure likes to stir up trouble. Mrs. Song sneered scornfully, but her earlier bravado had significantly diminished. Just thinking about letting the matter drop unsettles me. We ended up giving those two worthless girls a free pass. A free pass? Since when has anything in this world been free? Zhuang Rumen snorted, just wait and watch, it won't be long before those two nuisances crawl right back. Crawl back? Mrs. Song was taken aback for a moment. Just look at you, you have no idea about the inner workings of this issue. Zhuang Rumen dispiritedly commented, is it so easy to establish a female household? Is life that easy? Those two reckless girls, with no house or property, scarce a pound of meat on their bones, who would want to hire them for labor? What will they have for their living in the future? Mrs. Song suddenly saw the light, that's right, in the future they won't earn any money, they won't be able to eat, and when they grow hungry, they'll realize life was better with us. Then all we can do is wait for them to come crawling back. And when those two do return, each and every old and new score will be settled. If she doesn't flay them, she is not Mrs. Song. Meanwhile, Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui were still busy grinding beans. They made a thick soy milk by grinding the beans, added water to dilute it, sieved it to remove the residue, then thoroughly boiled the remaining soy milk in a big pot. Afterwards, they let the soy milk cool. When the temperature was right, it was time to make tofu. This is the most crucial step in making tofu. Whether the tofu pudding is made well will determine the quality of the tofu, as well as its texture. Generally, there are two methods to make tofu pudding. One involves the use of gypsum, producing a tofu that is soft and has high water content. The other one uses brine, creating a tougher tofu texture. The area here is in the north, where the primary method of making tofu is the latter one, using brine. However, the method Mrs. Wen used to make tofu was similar to the brine method, but she utilized a different technique called physalis tofu production. By using physalis, the clear ginger water produced during tofu making ferments, similar to the fermentation process of yeast used for steaming buns. The process involves using some leftovers from the previous bun baking process to ferment, playing the role of a starter for the next production cycle. Chapter 16, 16:16 Rice Vinegar and Tofu. 16 Chapter 016 Rice Vinegar and Tofu. Tofu made from physalis has a stronger tofu flavor and a long-lasting taste compared to tofu made from brine. It also avoids the potential burden that sodium chloride might impose on the body. Therefore, it is a kind of tofu that never bores even after eating a lot of it. This is precisely why the tofu initially made by Mrs. Wen tasted so good and therefore did good business. But now, they neither had fermented physalis available or brine. Zhuang Qingsui was clearly aware of this, her brows furrowed. Sister, does this mean we can't make tofu? As she spoke, a hint of a sob choked her voice. From grinding the beans last night until now, when the moon had already set, the two had worked for almost an entire night. They have finished boiling the soy milk. After adding the tofu pudding it would be the final step to mold the tofu, but unfortunately, they lacked the starter. In other words, all their efforts might have gone to waste. They couldn't rent the tofu shop, and if they wanted to earn money, they would have to find another way. All of their plans and hard work were in vain. It was really disappointing to have wasted all this time and effort, and all the hope that had filled them suddenly vanished. This sense of loss was indescribable. No wonder Zhuang Qingsui suddenly felt like an eggplant beaten by frost. Don't worry, I have a solution. Zhuang Qingning ruffled Zhuang Qingsui's hair, smiling. Sister has a solution. Zhuang Qingsui sniffed, glancing at her with disbelief, with her voice choked up. The old saying is true, a crafty cook cannot make something out of nothing. We don't have physalis or brine, how would you make tofu? Despite how much Zhuang Qingsui trusted her sister Zhuang Qingning, she also felt that there was no solution at this moment. We may not have physalis and brine, but we have this. Zhuang Qingning brought over a big bowl with a smile. What is this? Zhuang Qingsui looked at the transparent liquid in the bowl. After squinting at it for quite a while, she sniffed it and was incredibly surprised. Is this rice vinegar? Yes, it's rice vinegar. Zhuang Qingning nodded. Sister, do you plan to make tofu with rice vinegar? Zhuang Qingsui raised her voice in surprise, but I've never heard of making tofu with rice vinegar before, will it work? Whether it works or not, let's try it out first. Zhuang Qingning smiled. Anyway, we have no better options right now. That's true, Zhuang Qingsui nodded somewhat dazedly. Let's try, then. Success or failure, at least they will get a result, which is better than just sitting around doing nothing. Zhuang Qingning diluted the rice vinegar with water in a nearby bowl. While Zhuang Qingsui was not paying attention, she added a drop of the basic tofu-making secret formula into it, then slowly stirred the diluted rice vinegar in a circular motion into the cool soy milk in the tank. That's it. Zhuang Qingning put away the bowl and wash basin that had been used to hold the vinegar. Meanwhile, Zhuang Qingsui's eyes never left the tank, praying in her heart that this method would work. The soy milk that had the rice vinegar added was still not entirely calm due to the stirring, and it was creating ripples. As the ripples gradually settled, the originally pure white soy milk began to change. Transparent and green-yellow liquid gradually emerged, and flock-like substances gradually solidified together, slowly sinking to the bottom. Sister, the rice vinegar really works to thicken the tofu. Zhuang Qingsui exclaimed, hugging Zhuang Qingning who was beside her, pointing excitedly at the tank. Look, tofu pudding, there's so much tofu pudding. See, my solution works right. Zhuang Qingning raised her eyebrows high. This method of making tofu with rice vinegar, she only knew about it but hadn't had to use it in her previous life as she always had enough materials when making tofu. Therefore, before making this tofu pudding, Zhuang Qingning's firmness was just to comfort Zhuang Qingsui. She was not completely sure of success. Having a good result on the first try, Zhuang Qingning let out a long sigh of relief. Sister is really amazing. It was wrong not to believe in her sister and to doubt her earlier. Everything her sister says she can do, she can do. Zhuang Qingsui's mouth curved into a wide smile. Come help me start the fire. We need to stoke the stove so that the tofu pudding turns out even better. Zhuang Qingning, after inspecting the tofu pudding in the pot, smiled. All right. Zhuang Qingsui happily went to start the fire. The stove was relit, and the big pot gradually began to steam, and more tofu pudding solidified inside it, getting bigger and bigger. Once the tofu pudding had almost solidified, Zhuang Qingning moved over the equipment used to mold the tofu, laid out a fine cloth that could drain the soy milk but prevent the tofu pudding from leaking out, and ladled in the tofu pudding. The tofu pudding was all packed into the mold, the fine cloth was tied up, and the pressing board was put in place, followed by the placement of the heavy objects used for pressing. The soy milk flowed out like a small stream. Zhuang Qingning collected several buckets and put them into a nearby clean tank for fermenting into physalis for next time, and the rest was allowed to flow out along the water gutter paved with bluestone in the tofu shop. In winter, some people would come to the entrance of the tofu shop to wash their clothes with the warm soy milk because they disliked the cold well water. Now that the weather was warm, no one came for the soy milk, which flowed along the water gutter and into the wild grass at the entrance of the village. Slowly, no more soy milk was seeping out of the mold, indicating that the tofu was almost pressed well. The sisters removed the heavy objects used to press the tofu, lifted the fine cloth, and the soft and tender tofu appeared before their eyes. Ding! Congratulations to the host for triggering the tofu-making task, successfully making their first piece of tofu. Reward, 2 bottles of basic tofu-making secret recipe, tofu-making proficiency +1. Once the accumulated proficiency reaches 166, you can upgrade to the intermediate tofu-making recipe and unlock the intermediate tofu-making secret recipe. Excellent, excellent, free upgrade, and there are rewards. Xiaowu, this system is not bad, the tasks given are easy and can be completed conveniently. Xiaowu is a premium system. Proud face. The premium system should maintain its status, keep up the good work. Zhuang Qingning had a big smile on her face. Praises can be used as food, and it's no exception for the system. It smells so good. Zhuang Qingsui took a deep breath of the hot steam rising from the tofu and smacked her lips. One night's work must have made you hungry. Zhuang Qingning smiled, wielded the long and thin tofu knife nearby and skillfully sliced off a piece of tofu. She gently picked it up in her hand and cut it into 1-inch square pieces in her hand and placed it in a bowl. Chapter 17, 17017 Rent. 17 Chapter 017 Rent. Eat it while it's hot. Okay. Zhuang Qingsui accepted the offer, taking a piece first for Zhuang Qingning. Sister, you eat first. Zhuang Qingning chuckled, accepted it, and swallowed it down. The tofu exuded an intense bean aroma, the texture was soft and maintained its integrity, producing a profound and lingering aftertaste. In short, it was delicious. Not bad, it's edible. Zhuang Qingning smacked her lips, start eating, and taste the tofu we made. Okay. Zhuang Qingsui nodded heavily and began to eat the tofu. Delicious. Zhuang Qingsui let out a gasp of astonishment, before faring 2 more pieces into her mouth as though she were starving, only then slowly savoring it. It's really delicious. This must be the most delicious tofu I've ever had. It is even tastier than the physalis tofu Antwan made. If we took this tofu to sell, it would definitely sell well. Zhuang Qingsui's nose went red with excitement. If the tofu sold well, they wouldn't need to worry about their livelihood in the future, and they could live a good life. You 2 girls, what are you talking about selling? Mrs. Wan, carrying an oil lamp, entered the kitchen. Antwan, you're up early. Zhuang Qingning smiled, we just finished the tofu, and we were thinking of letting you try it when you woke up. How could I sleep with all the clanking going on all night? Mrs. Wan grunted and glanced at the neat block of tofu beside Zhuang Qingning, leaning forward to catch a whiff. After examining it for a while, she straightened up with a wrinkled brow, you do know how to curdle tofu with rice vinegar. At least, you're not a fool. Zhuang Qingning swiftly cut a piece of tofu, made it into small pieces and placed it in a dish, handing it over to Mrs. Wan. Antwan, try it. Mrs. Wan maintained her stern expression, picked up a piece from the tofu bowl and tried it. The more she chewed, the more she frowned. And she was holding the tofu in her mouth without swallowing it at all. Antwan, how's the taste? Zhuang Qingning's soft voice broke Zhuang Qingsui's daydream, startling Mrs. Wan, who was in deep thought. Mrs. Wan seemed to snap back to reality, swallowed the tofu in her mouth, and asked, apart from rice vinegar, what else did you add when you curdled the tofu? As expected, Mrs. Wan had picked up on something unusual about the delicious tofu. Zhuang Qingning smiled and replied, this is the secret weapon my sister and I plan to rely on to establish ourselves. I absolutely can't reveal it. Antwan, when you used to run a tofu shop, you never shared the secret of physalis with others, right? So you're not worried that if you don't say it, I won't rent this tofu shop to you. Mrs. Wen's eyes lifted slightly, emanating a flicker of coldness. But if Antwan doesn't rent it to me, you'll never know what's put in it. Maybe you won't even get to eat it in the future. Zhuang Qingning smiled slightly, looking up at Mrs. Wan. They faced off, creating a tense atmosphere. Neither party showed any sign of backing down. After a tense silence, Mrs. Wan suddenly let out a long sigh, crossing her hands behind her back. You are so determined to rent this tofu shop, what can an old woman like me say? When you're old, all you get is being bullied. There's no room for me to even speak. I have to talk to the village chief and see what's going on with the people in our village, whether there's any sense of order left. Mrs. Wan snorted, her face gloomy, she turned to leave, hands behind her back. Regardless of her attitude, she didn't say she wouldn't rent it. Since she didn't say no to the rent, it was taken as an implicit agreement. Zhuang Qingning relaxed her clenched fist inside her sleeve and quickly caught up with Mrs. Wan. So what about the rent? Rent. Mrs. Wan stopped in her tracks and gave Zhuang Qingning a side glance, do I look like someone short of money? Mrs. Wan was indeed not short of money, at least not the rent for this tofu shop. Although Mrs. Wen's children didn't live with her, they were always dutiful. They took care of her during the holidays, bringing money, clothes, and food. Mrs. Wen lived alone and naturally didn't spend much. Everyone in the village said that Aunt Wen might seem poor, but in reality, she was quite well off. A bowl of savory tofu pudding for breakfast every day, a plate of homemade tofu for dinner, and on the 1st and 15th of each lunar month, deep-fried tofu and tofu balls must be made. If you can do that, we can do it. Zhuang Qingning didn't wait for Mrs. Wen to finish, she immediately agreed. Aunt Wen, rest assured, we can do it. As long as they could rent the tofu shop, these weren't issues. Since you can do it, stick to it. From now on, the tofu shop is yours to use. Don't touch the things outside, arrange for whatever you need, repair whatever is broken, get whatever you want yourself. Also, the leftover soybeans in the tofu shop, if left there, they'll just spoil. For now, you can use them, and I'll just deduct the equivalent tofu from you later. Only one rule. Mrs. Wen gave Zhuang Qingning a sidelong glance. Never say in public that the tofu-making skills you have were taught by me. I can't possibly make such unpalatable tofu. It would ruin the reputation of my tofu shop. Aunt Wen, don't worry, I remember. Rest assured. Zhuang Qingning smiled and agreed, then picked up the tofu bowl that Mrs. Wen had only eaten a piece from and passed it to her. Today, I didn't know what you'd like for breakfast, so I didn't prepare tofu pudding. Please consider the hot tofu as today's portion. You can eat it with green onion. It's not bad as a side dish. Trying to get rid of me with unpalatable tofu. Mrs. Wen didn't soften her expression, but she did take it. Given the situation today, there's no tofu pudding for breakfast, so I'll reluctantly have a couple of bites. Having said that, she picked up the bowl and the oil lamp, and she walked out of the tofu shop. Seeing Mrs. Wen leaving, Zhuang Qingsui finally let out the breath she had been holding, followed by heavy breathing, and then she wiped off the sweat beads that had appeared on her forehead due to the tension. I thought Aunt Wen wasn't going to rent it to us. Why would she not? Zhuang Qingning smiled. As soon as it gets light, we'll carry the tofu to town to sell. While it's still dark, you better eat your tofu to fill your stomach, then take a nap here. I'll call you when it's time. Okay. Zhuang Qingsui yawned widely, rubbing her sore and tired eyes. After working all night, even though she had slept well the previous afternoon, she was extremely tired now. Sitting on the small stool and leaning against the large pillar next to it, Zhuang Qingsui fell asleep. The fire in the big stove hadn't completely died out, the tofu in the room was still hot, as was the liquid in the water tank waiting to ferment, heating up the entire tofu shop. Even in her sleep, she didn't feel cold. Zhuang Qingning, on the other hand, poured out the soybeans from the sack beside her, carefully selecting out the poor quality beans. Once the tofu production started, it couldn't stop. Chapter 18, 18:018 You're right about everything. 18 Chapter 018 You're right about everything. Beans need to be selected at this time. When they return from selling tofu, they will soak the beans. The timing is just right to grind for tofu at night and sell it the next morning. With this experience, they can start grinding tofu in the early morning next time, reducing the long waiting time after grinding. The rooster crowed twice, and the sky to the east gradually whitened. Early in the morning, the households began to stir, and quiet sounds of activity could be heard. Zhuang Qingning's bean selection was almost done. She dusted off her hands, beckoned Xiaowu over, and checked her diligence level. Over the course of yesterday and last night, she had earned 24 diligence points in total. Indeed, doing these things yielded more diligence points than purely physical labor. Thinking like this, if her tofu business continues to thrive and expand, and she opens a few more stores, would her diligence points increase exponentially? Would she then be able to exchange anything she wanted? He. She could see herself at the pinnacle of life just around the corner. Sigh, was she about to live the extravagant lifestyle she once despised? That thought made her a bit uneasy. Cough cough, host, it's broad daylight. The system feels obligated to remind you that the current exchange goods require fewer diligence points because most of them are necessities, and their prices are set according to your current diligence level. As your diligence points increase, the goods you need will become higher quality and more expensive. Moreover, many recipes and rare items in the future can only be obtained by completing tasks. Simply relying on diligence points will not suffice, so please let go of this misconception. Most importantly, you still owe 666 diligence points. All right, you're the system, you're always right. Her beautiful fantasy just birthed was instantly doused by the system, pulling her back to reality. Indeed, it was a system that cannot stand compliments. Zhuang Qingning sighed deeply in her heart. She stopped arguing with it, instead focusing on gathering the bamboo baskets, the cloche for covering tofu, and the balance scale which are essential for selling things. She lined the bamboo basket with 2 layers of cloche, placed the rectangular tofu pieces inside, used a simple stick as a separator, lined another layer of cloche, and placed another layer of tofu, and so on. She packed 4 layers of tofu in her own bamboo basket and 2 layers in Zhuang Qingsui's basket. As this was their first time making tofu, Zhuang Qingning made less than half the usual quantity. After deducting what they consumed themselves, the rest could be evenly distributed between the 2 baskets. After everything was packed, Zhuang Qingning woke up Zhuang Qingsui. The 2 of them washed their faces, cleaned up and ate the tofu that was kept warm on the big stove, along with the cornmeal pancakes that were kept on the stove. They then shouldered their bamboo baskets and headed towards town. The town was called Suanguang Town, the largest town nearby. There were small markets on ordinary days and large markets on the 5th and 10th days of each month. Today happened to be the 25th, a day for the big market. On market days, people from various villages and manors would bring their agricultural goods or handicrafts to the town for bartering or selling, ranging from home-raised poultry, eggs, handmade straw sandals, bamboo baskets, benches, etc. Therefore, lots of people were heading towards the town, including those from Zhuang Qingning's Enji village, and many seemed to be heading to the market. Among those heading to the market, many were taking bullock carts. Zhuang Qingning looked around and found one that wasn't too crowded, flagging it down. Heading to town. 1 coin per person. You 2 have so many items. Never mind, there aren't many passengers today, I won't charge you extra. Let's say 2 coins in total, said the bullock cart driver, a middle-aged man in his 30s, adjusting his straw hat. Zhuang Qingsui pursed her lips. She knew they didn't have any money on hand. Sister, why don't we walk instead? The basket isn't heavy, I can manage it. Zhuang Qingsui tugged at Zhuang Qingning's sleeve and whispered. The tofu we're each carrying is almost 30 pounds, it doesn't feel heavy at first, but by the time we get to town, our shoulders will be sore and bruised, Zhuang Qingning said. Moreover, by the time we walk there, it will be late. The tofu will have been in the basket for so long that it will lose some of its freshness and appeal. Riding the cart will get us there faster and save energy. If the tofu sells for a good price, we can easily cover the cart fare. As for the 2 coins needed for the cart, Zhuang Qingning grinned and said, Sir, my sister and I are heading into town to sell tofu. We haven't sold anything yet and don't have any money. But we'll definitely not ride your cart for free. How about I give you a piece of tofu to cover the fare? As she spoke, Zhuang Qingning reached into the basket, took out the largest piece of tofu and weighed it. Almost 3 pounds of tofu, selling for 1 coin per pound, that's 3 coins, enough to cover the 2-coin fare. It's profitable for you no matter how you look at it. When you return after the market, you can fry the tofu as a meal. That'd be worth it, right? The cart driver considered it for a moment, looking at the white tofu which seemed to have a tempting smell, then at the pedestrians coming and going on the street who seemed uninterested in taking the cart. He agreed and took the tofu. Fine, you 2 get on. All right. Zhuang Qingning settled both bamboo baskets comfortably, and helped Zhuang Qingsui onto the cart. The men flicked the whip, the ox mooed, lifted its foot and began the trip to town, with the cart moving slowly along. The cart was loaded with heavy sacks which apparently contained the grain they were going to sell, forming a fairly flat layer. With Zhuang Qingning and Zhuang Qingsui addition, the cart became a little crowded. Because the weather was pleasant and neither too hot nor too cold, most people heading to town didn't want to spend an extra coin to ride the cart, so along the way, there weren't many other passengers. The cart made its way to the bustling central street of the town, where the market stalls were usually set up. It was still early, with the sun not yet fully risen, but the central street was already crowded with people. Stalls of all kinds had almost fully occupied both sides of the street, leaving little available space. If you girls want to sell tofu, you should get off here. There won't be any good spots further up, said the cart driver. Zhuang Qingning looked around, Seeing many stalls selling eggs and vegetables, she figured this must indeed be a good spot and nodded, "Thank you, sir." Part 1 of the series ends here. Thank you for watching and listening. If you find it interesting, please give us a like, a comment and a subscription so that we have the motivation to make the next videos.